So today I thought I'd do something a little different and something that many of you have probably never seen before, a critical analysis style video on Dark Souls. I'm sure nobody has ever done anything like that before. Every Dark Souls boss, and that is not an exaggeration. That means all the main bosses, all the optional bosses, all the secret bosses, all the way through Dark Souls 1 to 3, including all the DLC. Disclaimer, there are channels entirely sustained off of Dark Souls content that have been going for years, go insanely in depth to the most specific things in this series, and do it with effortless style and grace. There is simply way more talented people than me doing great work on Dark Souls. I want to clarify that because I'm probably going to unintentionally sound like I'm quoting verbatim in this video because of the sheer volume and influence of Dark Souls content on this site already. Now, with that petty excuse out of the way, let's get to the basics. Before we start with the individual reviews, I want to lay down the basics of Dark Souls bosses and some ground rules moving forward. Most Dark Souls bosses can be split into different categories, with some mixing together 2 or more to create a more dynamic fight. At its most basic, they are ranged and melee. Beyond that, there is large and small, and beyond that, there is single or multiple. This is the most basic possible interpretation, but it helps to describe how each boss works on a mechanical level. Range versus melee mostly affects defense. It changes how the player is either going to dodge or block incoming attacks. A ranged boss is usually doing magic or fire attacks, which means the player either needs a high magic defense shield or would be better off dodging than blocking the hit. A melee boss instead will usually be much more aggressive and attention grabbing than a ranged boss, demanding much more careful dodging or blocking to avoid being hit by follow-up attacks. The enemy's size usually affects the attack style the player should take in engagement. A large enemy size, although visually more intimidating, is usually the easier from a mechanical perspective because that size can be abused. Attacks are slower, and the player can use their smaller size to hide in places that can easily avoid the slow sweeping attacks of larger bosses. Smaller bosses typically end up being the more challenging of the two. They are closer to the player in size, so the player can't as easily abuse their relative size, and their attacks are much quicker. These bosses require a much more passive and defensive playstyle instead of aggression. It's more about learning their attacks and how to counter them rather than all-out DPS. And finally, we've got numbers. Single bosses are usually the easier of the two for most players because they only have one boss at a time to contend with. But the game balances this by making boss fights with multiples weaker individually, which is the player's route to success. Sometimes this ends up being their fatal flaw. Other times, the sheer power of their attacks are enough to override the weakness of low health. These basic categories are the foundation of Dark Souls boss design. Each boss is like hitting the slot machine on each of these to see what you end up with. Take Sif for example, and you can see how she fits into a few of these categories. She's a melee boss, so the primary defense of the player is about dodging close range attacks. She's quite a large boss, so the best offense for the player is to abuse the large size to get in close and avoid strikes, and she's a single, so the player does not have to worry about another adversary to take into consideration. Most bosses can fit neatly into these categories and affects the most basic interaction and tactics needed to take them down. Then there is the huge caveat that this is a role-playing game with a stupid amount of weapons and tactics that I cannot reasonably discuss in one video. You've got straight swords, curved swords, thrusting swords, great swords, curved great swords, ultra great swords, daggers, katanas, axes, great axes, hammers, great hammers, fists and claws, spears, halberds, reapers, whips, bows, and then a variety of magic attacks from miracles to sorceries. And each category has multiple weapons each, all with their own moves, and each one of these can affect how a boss plays in pretty substantial ways, from an ultra greatsword being much more effective for Deacons of the Deep, to a katana with bleed damage being the most effective against the Abyss Watchers. I mention this because I'm going to be talking in more general terms with these bosses, mostly their movesets and unique elements that separate them from others instead of specific tactics. I'll mention some of those when they come up, but I will mostly not be commenting on how certain weapons affect certain bosses, but know that that is a whole other level of fair criticism and analysis to make here that I will mostly be ignoring for the sake of brevity. I also feel I should mention my experience with the series to avoid mentions of comparisons with games in the series that I have not played. Unfortunately, I do not have experience with the whole overarching Soulsborne series that I like to have when making these videos. I have played Dark Souls 1 through 3, obviously, a few times, but I don't have any experience with Demon's Souls or Bloodborne. So while comparisons may be extremely obvious and valid with those games, I won't be voicing them because I have no first-hand experience with them. So ground rules out of the way, let's start with Dark Souls 1. A tutorial boss should rather be judged on what essentials it can teach the player than how difficult it will be for returning players like myself. It's easy to write this boss off as just the tutorial boss, as any advanced player should have absolutely no trouble dispatching them. The generous arena, slow sweeping attacks, and easily abusable size make this an extremely slow and deliberate boss that's one of the easiest, if not the easiest, to dodge in the entire game. On how well it teaches the player, I'd say it's decent. Its most dramatic teaching tool is that it's the first instance of a plunging attack in the game and shows that it can do incredible damage if performed correctly, but plunging attacks are pretty underutilized in the overall game, so that really only comes in handy very occasionally and in use against the next boss. The problem is that this boss is so slow and passive that it doesn't really teach the player how to fight regular enemies either. Really, its most useful lesson to teach is how to deal with large enemies. Hide at their backside where their mostly front-facing attacks can be avoided much easier. It's an okay boss, all things considered. Its design is pretty intimidating early on, and the first bit where you are supposed to run away from it is a solid moment of panic, but mechanically, it's nothing too special. The Taurus Demon is a bit of a weird mashup between a couple of unique boss design ideas. There's the pre-boss fight action to perform of killing the two archers on top of this tower. The idea is that dealing with them in the middle of the fight is much harder than killing them before, and it's basically teaching you about the plunging attack. Again, just like the last boss, except doing it over and over again this time. The optimal strategy for most players is to run back to the tower and do a plunging attack, then run to the other side of the bridge and bait an attack long enough to where you can climb up the ladder again and then rinse and repeat. You can fight him straight up, but the narrow pathway of the bridge and the awkwardly slow and powerful attacks make this a pretty challenging fight early on if you do it that way. Also, if you use the gold pine resin picked up back in the Undead Burg, it makes this fight much easier. I tend not to use resins because I think it makes boss fights way too easy, but this one seems to have been placed deliberately for this fight, so it does warrant a mention. It's a decent fight, mostly because of the gorgeous arena, but the design is a bit weird for this early in the game. The first genuinely good boss, I think, is the Gargoyles, which have become famous for roadblocking many players from ever finishing the game. It's the first multi-boss fight in the series when a second Gargoyle shows up at the first, reaching half health. It's a genuinely scary and panic-inducing moment that destroys the player's confidence just when they think they've started to get the upper hand. The thing with this fight, though, is that it's illustrative of a larger issue with the first Dark Souls in particular. The lock-on system is busted in the first game, not the camera movements when locked on. Those are very solid and reliable, just as with later games. The problem is with how it restricts your rolling. Dark Souls does have omni-rolling, but not when locked onto an enemy. When locked on, you can only roll in 4 directions: forwards, backwards, or left or right. This means that moving the stick to the top left corner, for example, will have a 50-50 chance of rolling forward or left. It's unreliable, it's clunky, and I think it makes many of the boss fights much more difficult than they would be otherwise. Look at this footage of me not using the lock-on. You have a much freer range of movement, not only being able to omni-roll to more adeptly dodge incoming attacks, but have much easier positioning available to you as well. Without using the lock-on, the Gargoyles are a much more approachable challenge and one of the more exciting and thrilling fights in the game, dealing with 2 powerful bosses at once. The challenge of fighting multiple enemies is dependent on keeping both targets in view, baiting out both their attacks, and maintaining enough distance not to get overwhelmed. It's a different type of challenge. It's not solely about learning how to counter an enemy's moveset, but also a challenge of intense situational awareness and timing. The 2 Gargoyles have different movesets, that means you won't be completely overwhelmed with melee attacks. The first Gargoyle has incredible range with wide sweeping strikes. It's better to get as close as possible to avoid the majority of the wide swings, and the second gargoyle most often breathes fire in a cone in front of him. These two styles of attacks make it challenging but not unfair to fight both at once. The optimal strategy is to separate the two of them long enough for the player to sneak a few hits in between. The gargoyles in many ways are the gatekeepers to most players' enjoyment of the game and the series in general. Not only do they mark the first real step in progress by ringing the first bell of awakening, but they serve as a climactic peak to the first section of the game. I just wish the game taught its players better to use the lock-on more sparingly instead of becoming totally reliant on it. This boss sucks. Surprising absolutely no one, the Capra Demon is one of the worst bosses in the game with lazy and unbalanced design. You're trapped in a tiny room with two of the most awkward and fast enemies in the game to deal with at the same time as the boss. The beginning of this fight is a total crapshoot. Best thing to do is to run to the top of the stairs and pray to whatever gods you believe in that you can kill the dogs before the onslaught of attacks overwhelms you. If you can kill the dogs, then the fight is basically over. You can either repeat the plunging attack strategy for the third time or fight him normally. Both are pretty easy. The only attack to watch out for is the two-handed swipe, which can easily one-hit kill you at this point in the game. Otherwise, the attacks are very generously telegraphed and easy to avoid. He doesn't have a lot of health either. The first half of Dark Souls is often regarded as brilliant and close to perfect, and I generally agree, except for this fight and this area. The first truly large boss in Dark Souls is more visually and thematically successful than it is mechanically. Its design is one of the most memorable of the series and truly representative of the depths, the area the boss resides in. All mashed together dragon and crocodile split open down the middle and covered in teeth. The sheer size can be intimidating, and its health bar is madness for this early in the game. Mechanically, it's okay for a large boss. Easy enough to hide on its side to avoid most of the front-facing attacks. Most of its attacks are pretty straightforward, except for this walk, which basically turns its whole body into damage on contact on a dime. It does way too much damage for how little it's telegraphed, and it's an easy way to get killed. It can be a weird fight because you'll be hacking away at it for minutes, only to suddenly die instantly from this random attack. Otherwise, most of its attacks are easily avoidable jumps and slow sweeps from the head of the dragon. It also has this attack where it spews out something that slows the player's movement, but it doesn't last long enough for it to be all that notable. It's a decent fight because of its visual design, but it isn't anything spectacular mechanically. Quelaag is the first single boss encounter in the game that really shines in its design. This fight is in a huge open arena which appears to be in the player's favor at first. The interesting thing with this fight is that Quelaag will regularly be spraying patches of lava all over the arena to limit the player's arena size. It becomes a spatial challenge of a constantly evolving and shifting arena. Quelaag's attacks make abusing her size and front-facing attacks the most optimal strategy. Her horizontal sword swings are wide and extremely fast, making them very difficult to dodge. They also do fire damage, which means that blocking them with most shields will still inflict a decent amount of damage. Her horizontal swings have relatively short range, but she also has a long-distance thrust that can catch you off guard when trying to heal or maintain distance. But the most threatening attack by far is the AoE blast that does immense damage and can easily one-shot at a fair level at this point. The problem with this attack is that it isn't all that well telegraphed, the most dramatic sign being Quelaag herself laying down at the front of the spider. But if the player is busy hacking away at the side, then the wind-up to this attack looks very similar to the front-facing lava attack, which is totally safe for the player at this position. It's very easy to get caught off guard by this attack, and even after beating this boss God knows how many times before, it still got me a couple of times on this playthrough. Quelaag also serves as the second climactic fight, ending your journey underground through the depths and Blighttown to ring the second Bell of Awakening. After the two Bells of Awakening have been rung, the gate to Sen's Fortress opens where the Iron Golem resides. The Iron Golem is a massive boss in size done a little differently than the animal-like bosses up to this point. The Iron Golem wields an axe with very generously telegraphed attacks instead of thrashing and AoE attacks like the Gaping Dragon and Quelaag before it. The thing that really makes this fight challenging is the tiny arena and the huge knockback of attacks. I am terrible at this fight and honestly consider it one of the harder in the game. I got lucky this playthrough, but I normally get killed a few times, don't laugh, from getting knocked off by one unlucky dodge. The Iron Golem also has a ranged attack where he throws a blast of air from his axe that can easily catch you off guard. This fight has an X factor that makes it unique among any other fight in the game, and that's that the small arena can work in your favor as well. Once the Golem reaches around 75% health, he will stumble for a few seconds. If you can stack enough damage during this time, he will completely fall over, and if he's close enough to the edge, he'll go right off and end it right there. I wasn't able to do it for this fight because once again, I am really bad at it. It's pretty decent, all things considered. The classic, the big one, the infamous fight to define the first Dark Souls. What else can be said about this fight? Whenever most players think of Dark Souls, this is probably the image in their mind. Ornstein and Smough are the peak of the first half of Dark Souls and the peak of the game in my opinion. This is a beautiful, impeccably well balanced and exciting boss fight and without a doubt, the best in the base game. Ornstein and Smough's movesets synchronize perfectly to make them an incredible challenge. Ornstein is swift, agile, and has both ranged and fast swiping close range attacks that make him a threat at absolutely any area of the arena. Smough is slow, bumbling, but hits hard and extremely deadly at close range. Like the gargoyles before them, the main challenge is to keep both in vision simultaneously and bait out attacks to sneak in some quick damage. Only this time, that is significantly more challenging. The gargoyles were both pretty slow, and the second gargoyle's moves were limited and easy to avoid. The generous arena and numerous pillars are really your only defense. The rest is down to patience, rigorous situational awareness, and timing your dodges and attacks. Ornstein and Smough are a huge difficulty spike for first-time players and will lay ruin to players caught in the unfortunate traps of shield or lock-on reliance. And yet it gets even tougher. This is the first boss fight in the game with a second stage that amplifies this boss to sheer madness difficulty levels for new players. When one of them falls, the other will absorb their power and regain full health as well as a new moveset with even more powerful attacks. It's definitely easier to kill Ornstein first as he is without a doubt the more challenging of the two in his second form. In their second form, they will gain some of the moves of their fallen comrade. Smough's attacks will become electrified, and Ornstein gains the ground slam from Smough with an electrical wave that pulses around the impact. The second stage is unpredictable and arguably even more challenging than the first phase because of the beefed up attacks. Mistakes become even riskier just as the player's supplies are dwindling. I can't do much other than gush about this fight. I think it's a multi-boss fight done about as perfectly as it can, only faulted by the Dark Souls 1 core mechanics like the busted lock-on system and the lack of collision detection. It's at this point that the game opens up from a primarily linear structure and splits off into 4 major paths, as well as a wealth of optional bosses and areas for the player to tackle in any order. So far, I have tried to structure this in chronological order, but from this point on, it's basically in the order that I played them. The Moonlight Butterfly is less of a boss and more of a showcase of unique enemy design indicative of the area it resides in, the Darkroot Forest. All this fight really consists of mechanically is dodging or blocking its projectiles and waiting for it to land to score huge damage. I normally like the unique boss fights in this series even though they often aren't as satisfying as a more conventional fight, but this one is pretty dull. Cool visuals, lacking design. The saddest boss in the series, Sif the Great Grey Wolf guards his master Artorias' grave from robbers as eternal loyalty. For what's supposed to be more of a lore showcase instead of a mechanics-focused boss fight, Sif is no pushover. She's one of the toughest bosses in the game for shield-heavy players because her combos can easily punch through late-game stamina bars, and they have far reach and speed to match it. Sif's weakness is her size and her front-facing sword attacks. By getting underneath her, you can avoid most of the sword strikes and get in some free hits. The challenge is how agile she is. She will constantly be jumping around the arena, which means that learning how to dodge through her strikes is the primary challenge. The end of the fight is a memorable heartbreaker. Sif will actually limp, and her attacks become awkward as she stumbles around feeling weak. The real gut punch is remembering Sif's purpose in the first place. All she wanted to do was guard her master's grave, who sacrificed himself to protect her. Despite it being just okay mechanically, Sif is one of the more memorable boss fights in the series for this reason. It's a fight that manages to use both lore and its own mechanics to tell a story. We've looked at one boss previously that served as an early game DPS check, but the Four Kings take that idea and take it to the extreme. The Four Kings is literally 4 kings, all of whom spawn in one after the other after a certain amount of time. Fighting one is difficult enough with their incredible damage output, range, and slow-moving magic attacks that will completely circle the arena if dodged. They are designed specifically to be difficult to fight in multiples, so burning them down as fast as you can is the priority. It's no coincidence that the very large ember from maxing out weapon upgrades is found in this area. Their attacks are slow and don't have a huge amount of tracking on them, so once you can close the gap, it isn't all that difficult to burn them down. But closing that gap can be mighty difficult with their insane range and absurd damage. Mechanically, it's one of the hardest fights in the game and pretty well designed. On top of that, fighting in a black void at the bottom of a corrupted hole in the world makes for a suitably atmospheric experience as well. One of the most complex and well-defined characters in the lore, unfortunately, doesn't get the best fight. The game gets points for doing something interesting with the format, though. The first time most players will encounter Seath is in a supposed-to-lose room, which then spawns the player in a jail cell with a new bonfire instead of where they previously rested. It's a scary moment that makes the player feel really vulnerable. Thankfully, the snakes are the worst guards ever, and you can encounter him later in the Crystal Caves for a proper fight. I haven't talked about boss runs too much so far because I feel that it would bleed into a larger discussion on the level design, but the run to Seath stands out as being one of the most obnoxious in the entire series, requiring the player to run a huge distance and navigate the invisible floors of the Crystal Caves over and over again. The fight itself is pretty bland. Seath only has a couple of attacks, spraying crystals all over the floor and tail swipes. He's one of the easiest bosses in the game to avoid and doesn't have health relative to his size either. The fight's also unpolished and glitchy because of his sheer size. It's easy to get trapped against the wall because of his width and get caught in a never-ending loop of crystal attacks. It's not a very good fight mechanically, but the lore and the changes to the format make it bearable. A secret boss found by returning to the tutorial area, Stray Demon is a reskin of the Asylum Demon with a couple of new attacks. I don't feel I can be too critical of it because it's meant to be a cool bonus of an obscure secret, but mechanically, it's nothing thrilling. One of the new attacks is a massive damage AoE attack that is easy to spot, but only after seeing it a couple times. Otherwise, he just has increased range and damage. It would be a pretty bad fight if it wasn't for the nostalgia of returning to the tutorial area. This is another boss that exists more for the lore than for its mechanics. This is a well-defined character with a tragic backstory, so it does get points for that, but mechanically, this is the easiest boss in the game. If you run back to the fog door and hit him a few times, then it's an instant kill. I get why it exists, but it's pretty weak. A second reskin of the Asylum Demon, only this time a fiery reskin of the Stray Demon, who was itself a reskin of the Asylum Demon, so it's starting to get ridiculous at this point. His moveset appears to be identical to the Stray Demon's, just with a fire AoE instead of magic. Not much else to say about the same boss again. It's an okay fight mechanically, but using the same boss 3 times is when it starts to get annoying. A very unique fight visually is let down mechanically by awkward cramped space, hitboxes, and a mostly conventional moveset. The arena is unique, a lava-filled swamp with small individual islands to fight on, but this ends up backfiring with the awkward flailing and scrambling of the boss's moveset in tight spaces. The Centipede Demon's moveset is also quite limited, with easily avoidable stomps and slow, deliberate windups for its forward arm attack. He does have a grab which looks scary but doesn't do an insane amount of damage and is very easy to avoid. It ends up being mostly okay. Some cool visuals but nothing really special in terms of mechanics. The Bed of Chaos is the quintessential Dark Souls boss. It represents everything that's great about the series, like its flawless jumping mechanics, brilliant hit detection, and falling into pits over and over and over again. It really elevates falling into pits into a higher art form. I mean, never has it been done so perfectly, and it really represents just how perfect and amazing and inspiring Dark Souls, and this boss in particular, really is, in a brilliant, and may I say, perfect design choice. You even have to run a quarter-mile back every single time you die. What fun! In another absolutely perfect design choice, the actual boss is this little worm thing that dies in one hit. It really puts into perspective how all of the careful dodging, patience, and player skill of other boss fights is totally overrated. This is the peak of Dark Souls right here. I could just stop this video here because nothing will be better than this. The Bed of Chaos gets an 11 out of 10 because it's perfect. And it's perfect. And did I say it's perfect? I just wanted to make that clear. Priscilla is the only 100% optional boss in Dark Souls, residing in a secret area and who the player has to engage first. What's surprising about this boss being so hidden is that it has a unique mechanic that no other boss has. Priscilla can turn invisible, and the only way to locate her is to follow her footprints in the snow. It's genuinely different and interesting, and I wish this boss had more health and was expanded into a larger fight. As it stands, she has the smallest health bar of any boss in the game and goes down too quick to really appreciate the mechanics. Okay, so I lied about that. The boss with the smallest health bar is Pinwheel, who is a well-known joke in terms of difficulty. Same with Priscilla. I think this could have been a really good fight if he had more health. Pinwheel can spawn multiple copies of himself and wields ranged magic attacks, generally pretty rare for bosses. The presentation of it is also excellent, taking place inside a massive tomb decorated with skeletons, but man oh man does he go down quick. Same with Priscilla. If this was expanded into a more substantial fight, it could have been one of the better ones. The final Lord Soul in the game, I think, is the best of the bunch. I love that it's literally in a hole at the bottom of the Tomb of Giants. Nito's got a unique mechanic of his own besides his usual melee and AoE attacks, and that's that his arena is filled with hostile skeletons, making it very easy to get swarmed. Thankfully, his damaging wide strikes and powerful AoE will end up killing them for you, so the goal is to get him to kill his own backup and then get in some hits before they respawn. It's an oddly satisfying sort of rhythm. It's very defensive and time consuming, but also intense with the amount of enemies gradually building until it seems unsustainable. The only thing holding it back is a couple of oversights. The drop into the arena does a ton of damage, which is frankly a little cheap and would be potentially lethal if the player is low on Estus, and he has a ranged attack with a knife coming up through the ground that is remarkably inconsistent in hit detection. Nito is the one Lord Soul boss whose more complicated mechanics actually work in his favor instead of becoming an overbearing gimmick. The first DLC boss marks a notable step up in quality over the main game. The Sanctuary Guardian is extremely aggressive, has multiple forms of ranged and very difficult to dodge melee attacks. He can move across the arena in a second, can shoot lightning down from the air, and charge the player down in seconds. Attack windows are very brief, and healing windows are even less so. It's a trend that continues with the other DLC bosses of increased aggression and speed compared to the main game's lineup. The Sanctuary Guardian can charge you down in seconds and has some of the trickiest to dodge beast attacks in the game, with some surprisingly fast and damaging head swipes and even a tail that can poison you, discouraging the usual beast strategy of going for the back or the sides. I'm really bad at this fight, but I can't deny it's unique and solidly designed. Most people's favorite fight in Dark Souls 1 seems to be Artorias, and while I enjoy Ornstein and Smaug a tiny more personally, I can't deny that this is a close second easily. Artorias is the most straightforward duel in the entire game. His moveset is one of the more varied of any boss: a long-range jumping attack, front flip hits, close-range swipes, throwing abyss, and eventually buffing himself with an AoE that gives all of these attacks substantially improved damage. While the moveset is great, it's the speed of Artorias that makes this such an intense fight. He is the fastest boss in the game, and trying to get more than one hit at a time with a moderately fast weapon is almost impossible without taking damage on a follow-up hit. The fight is incredibly defensive and requires the most patience of any boss in the game. which in a nutshell is what Dark Souls is supposed to be all about. If you distill Dark Souls into its basest mechanics, it would look something like this. Beyond the excellent fight mechanically, Artorias has an important backstory and surprises that enhance the fight even more. Artorias is the second of Gwyn's knights you fight directly alongside Ornstein. Artorias was sent to stop the spread of the Abyss alone, and in the present day, he's known as a legend who pulled it off. But when pulled into the past, this Artorias doesn't look like he's capable of conquering anything. He's missing his famed Great Shield, and if you look closely, his arm is actually broken and dangling. The shock of seeing this supposed legend totally corrupted is memorable, and also how the DLC handles time travel. The amazing thing about the DLC and this fight in particular is that during the fight you slowly begin to realize that Artorias' legend isn't actually his, but yours. You just don't know it yet. The first proper dragon boss in the series is Calamite, who is restricted to the ground after being pinned by one of Hawkeye Go's arrows, but has considerable size and a varied and threatening moveset to make him a challenge worthy of his appearance. Calamite has one of the most unique attacks in the series, placing a hex on the player with a grab attack that will double damage dealt for a period of time afterwards. Beyond that, he's got his standard fare of swiping and close-range magic attacks, but his moveset is surprisingly varied and encompassing, unlike most of the other large-sized bosses up to this point. He is extremely mobile and won't stay in the same position for long, as well as having a backwards kick and side attacks to keep most players off guard. He can also briefly hover for some forward strike attacks, as well as a slow-moving AoE fire blast that spreads out to huge distances. His head swipe in particular has very tricky timing, and it's very easy to accidentally get caught by the end of the strike, even with a properly timed dodge at the beginning. This boss is entirely optional, but ends up being one of the absolute best fights in the game and remains one of the stronger dragon boss fights in the series to come. The final DLC boss is brutal. Manus is without a doubt in my mind the most challenging boss in the first Dark Souls. It's mostly subjective which boss you find the most challenging, but Manus has a few factors that make him a towering challenge for most players. First of all, he has an insanely long and damaging combo that will lock the player in for the remaining amount of damage if hit by a single strike of the combo. The strikes are so fast that I've never been able to avoid every strike while at close range without just spamming the dodge button and getting lucky. He also has absurdly powerful dark magic attacks that can easily one-shot a maxed out leveled character at the peak of their abilities. These are near impossible to dodge and can only be reliably avoided with a secret item, the silver pendant found behind a fake wall back in Ulasil. Because this has to be activated from the quick select menu, it's very easy to get caught off guard by these attacks, switching back and forth from Estus to the pendant. He's pretty much the combination of everything that makes a boss difficult in the series up to this point. High damage, obviously, but extremely aggressive and wide damaging area of attacks. Despite the challenge, it's completely warranted and frankly welcome considering how generally easy most bosses in Dark Souls 1 are compared to the rest of the series. The build-up and the surrounding area of the boss is fantastic, taking you through the Abyss itself in much greater detail than the Four Kings boss fight too. Manus' visual design, vicious difficulty, and build-up make him the most intimidating boss in the game and by extension, one of the best. Another secret boss that's less of a boss fight really than it is a cool extra for players to find in their second playthrough. Gwyndolin is the last remaining child of Gwyn to remain in Anor Londo, but shares none of the dynastic glory that is told of the family in the lore. He's small, he's weak, and he uses sorcery and arrows like a regular player would. I don't have a lot to say about this fight because of how short and easy it is. The one cool element is the arena itself, which is basically a room endless in length that keeps shifting every time the player catches up to Gwyndolin. His attacks are all ranged and can inflict massive damage, but are very easy to avoid and easy to spot. After running up to him once or twice, he'll go down pretty easy. A decent addition for the lore, but since this is mostly about the mechanics, I have to concede that it's a little disappointing in that aspect. Most action RPGs end with an epic, climactic battle between two adversaries. Dramatic orchestral music and a duel on the edge of a cliff during a rainstorm or something of the like. What makes the final boss of Dark Souls so brilliant is how understated it is. Gwyn is no longer the Lord of Sunlight. He's the Lord of Cinder, a broken old man residing over a crumbling world, desperately holding on to whatever shred of life he has left. His family is gone, his knights are dead, and his kingdom is long fallen. But the real tragedy is what it represents for the player. If the player links the fire, then this is what will eventually become of them. Gwyn is the ultimate fate of all undead. He has gone completely hollow by keeping the fire burning for so long it has ruined him. Everything works towards emphasizing this sad and hopeless version of the man who once defeated the ancient dragons. The desolate area and final arena, the fact that Gwyn is the only boss in the game who can be parried, a humiliating showcase of how far his power has fallen, and the absolutely legendary score accompanying the fight. It's the best boss theme in the game, simple but endlessly effective. Gwyn is not the most challenging and powerful fight in the game like so many other games. Well, actually he might be if you haven't learned how to parry at this point. He is extremely aggressive, fast, and has fire damage that will penetrate most shields. But if you've got parrying down, then you've got Gwyn down, and I think that is the most satisfying way to play this boss. He's the one boss in the game who is actually more satisfying to completely dominate. Dark Souls ends with a different take on a boss fight. It's not a mechanical peak or the ultimate test of challenges, but somber, reserved, and climactic without being bombastic or epic. It's a confrontation that doesn't try to make the player feel good for beating a really difficult game, but challenges their journey with a close-up of the empty shell they will eventually become. Dark Souls is about the last breaths of a dying world. Gwyn is one of the absolute greatest bosses in the series for so perfectly reflecting Dark Souls' core themes: grand beauty and despair, and ambivalent triumph. Dark Souls 2 is universally regarded as the weakest Souls game, but most of these reasons don't seem to be specifically related to the bosses. The changes it makes to boss fights are not all that substantial, and for the most part, the bosses play very similarly to Dark Souls 1 with some improvements and steps back in respective areas. I would actually argue that Dark Souls 2 is a better game than the first, but that would mostly be down to the level design and combat, which this video is not really about. When it comes to the bosses, Dark Souls 2's lineup is much more of a mixed bag, even compared to Dark Souls 1, and it will seem like I am showcasing Dark Souls 2 at its worst some of the time. Some of Dark Souls 2's worst bosses take place in fantastic areas and vice versa. So this is not a general statement of the game's quality, but specifically focused on the bosses and the bosses alone, along with the occasional comment of the run to the boss when it warrants it. The first proper boss for many players is probably the last giant, but you can encounter one of Dark Souls 2's more unique bosses first in an optional encounter before the actual set battle for him. The Pursuer's moveset and attacks are mostly straightforward, horizontal and thrusting attacks, a ranged charge, and a thrust that can curse you temporarily. But what makes him unique is the title himself. The Pursuer does genuinely pursue and will be encountered multiple times through the rest of the game in innocuous and sometimes unfortunate places. He has mostly the same moveset and attacks every time, but it's always a little concerning when he does show up because it's completely unexpected. It's unfortunate that his health doesn't seem to scale enough with the players, so what was supposed to be a nemesis that constantly dogs the player throughout the journey ends up becoming a joke after the player's beefed up with weapon upgrades and levels. He's also able to be parried, a welcome change that Dark Souls 2 makes with many of its bosses, which does help to make the fight feel a little more dynamic and varied. What would be a good but nothing amazing fight is elevated a little by the unique pursuit that follows the initial fight. Then we've got the first normal type of fight that comes quite a bit later in the game than the Asylum Demon in Dark Souls 1. It's a shame that it's so simple, only really having 2 attacks, stomping and swiping. The only thing really saving it is the lore implications. The last giant is the last giant, whose colleagues can be seen dead around the map after they fought in a war before the kingdom fell. They do a thing kind of like Sif. When he reaches low health, he'll actually tear his own arm off and use it as a weapon. Like with the giant tree piercing through his chest, it's trying to be sad and tragic like Sif, but doesn't commit to it with the music or the arena or the deep backstory. Unfortunately, Dark Souls 2 does not give the greatest first impression with one of its least remarkable bosses in the whole lineup so early in the game. Dragon Rider is a pretty standard fight with some interesting level design elements that give the fight a bit of uniqueness. If you wipe out all of the enemies on this map and pull a couple of hidden switches, it will raise the outer circle of the arena and make the fight easier or harder depending on how you see it. If you fight him without raising the outer circle, it's easy to accidentally roll off, but also much easier for him to be knocked off as well. Otherwise, it's a pretty standard little duel that does its job. Very slow and telegraphed attacks, relatively low health, and huge windows for attack. It feels more like a pumped up normal enemy than a boss, really. A rematch with Ornstein solo proves that he's not nearly as threatening without his fat friend to toss you around. Regardless, it's a pretty solid fight mechanically, although I wish he had more health to make this fight a little more challenging. Attacks are really fast and have surprising range, and they even added some dark magic range spells that can catch you off guard. If he had more health and was a later game boss with an expanded moveset, then this could have been one of the best bosses in the series. As it stands, it ended up just being kind of okay. A double-sided, immense early game challenge, the Flexile Sentry was extremely tough for me on my first playthrough because of the heavily damaging long-range combos and the rising water that will eventually make it almost impossible to win without a shield. It's another DPS test to try and burn down the sentry before the water rises enough to slow down your roll, only the sentry has 2 sides, one wielding 2 maces and the other swords. The sword side is significantly more difficult and a little bullshit because there is almost no telegraph to his attacks. 1 minute, nothing. The next, you are caught up in a flurry of strikes that stun lock you into submission. The mace side also has a forward thrusting attack that is very deceptively telegraphed the first time you see it. The water rises very gradually, but if it gets to waist high, it's pretty much a game over. I like it for the timed challenge and the unique design, I just wish the moves were a little more polished. The first triple boss in the series, and one of the better ones in Dark Souls 2. The Ruined Sentinels aren't very tough individually, but have movesets and weapons that are a nightmare to fight in multiples. Thankfully, the game doesn't just drop you in a pit with all 3 at once, so it allows you to fight one on his own on this little platform with a second and third spawning in later on timers. They have very wide range and knockback, which makes using a shield very challenging on this little platform. After some time, the second will spawn in and will jump up. If the first one is not dead, then it becomes near impossible to fight on the platform, and the third will follow shortly after. DPS is king. It's testing the amount of damage you can output in a certain amount of time. Once the fight moves below, you have a lot more room to maneuver, but usually 2 at once to deal with. This is pretty straightforward and fun. Just like usual, bait out attacks and sneak in damage in between. The only attack I think is unfair is this spin attack, which hits so fast consecutively that it seems impossible not to get hit if you are within range. I managed to avoid it a couple of times, but it was from frantically mangling the dodge button in pure panic and seemingly getting lucky. It's too fast to space out dodge timings. Otherwise, this is a very good fight and a solid escalation of some previous boss design. I have a feeling this is going to be the most controversial opinion in this video because I really like the Belfry Gargoyles. Everybody seems to hate this boss. They call it a lazy reskin of the Gargoyles, just cynically done with 5 of them instead of 2. I couldn't disagree more. This version of the Gargoyles has been smartly tweaked to be a more intense challenge than the ones from the first game, which were, let's be honest, a joke once you disengage the lock-on. These gargoyles have a way more threatening moveset of extremely fast close range attacks and long range sweeps from the air, but what I enjoy the most about this fight is the changes made to the health and numbers. The gargoyles in Dark Souls 1 were fairly strong individually because there was only 2 of them. These gargoyles are much weaker individually but will continuously spawn on timers, eventually stacking up to all 5 if you haven't managed to kill any. It's the same DPS check idea from the first game, only more complicated and more difficult, this one taking place later in the game. The only problems I have with the fight is that the gargoyles' movesets do not synchronize well together, and you can easily die in a flurry of close range attacks if they group up, but overall I think the adjustments to the health and numbers are very successful. And the main boss of the area is the Lost Sinner, a mostly straightforward duel against a humanoid with a big weapon. The fight does have one unique element, and that's its lighting. There are 2 torches you can light from outside the arena that will illuminate the boss fight and make it significantly easier. If you don't, then not only will the fight be much darker, but your lock-on will disengage after she does a jumping attack, which can easily confuse the player and get them killed. And this is Dark Souls 2, mind you, where the lock-on actually works. Otherwise, it's a solid fight of a pretty standard moveset and generous health pool. I like this one. The Executioner's Chariot is one of the most unique bosses in the series. This arena is a circular, narrow pathway filled with hostile skeletons and sorcerers, all with a chariot himself circling the arena for huge damage if landed. The goal is to run to the other side of the arena while avoiding the skeletons and sorcerers and taking cover in the little alcoves on the side when the chariot makes its pass. Eventually there's a gate at the end, and bringing it down will cause the chariot to crash and enter the second stage of the fight. From there, it's a pretty straightforward beast boss fight. Avoid the charge attacks and kicks and pick away at him until it's over. The horse is pretty slow and not all that threatening, so it's a little disappointing that the second stage of the fight is so conventional after the more interesting first stage. Another unique fight like the Executioner's Chariot, and although it's definitely less imaginative than the Chariot, it is much more successful mechanically. The Skeleton Lords is a massive wave of individually weak enemies but potentially deadly together, so the goal is to circle the huge arena and pick off a couple skeletons at a time while trying not to get overwhelmed. The problem is that the damage they dish out, even within a large group, is so low that it encourages greedy and sloppy play. It becomes far too easy to just storm through all of the incoming blows and take out huge groups with generous time to run away and heal afterwards. It's something that Dark Souls generally discourages. It's supposed to be about patience and timing. If you ignore this aspect of the fight, however, it's still pretty fun, and the boss theme is great. Basically, the pinwheel of Dark Souls 2, the Covetous Demon, is the joke boss in Dark Souls 2. All he really does is lazily flop around and has maybe the largest attack windows of any enemy in the game. The design is interesting. A boss with limited movement could have been made unique by using the arena to limit the player's movement, maybe by having the arena shift periodically to reveal poison traps or something, but the end result is, well, yeah, not much to say about this one. The area boss of Earthen Peak, Mytha, has an X factor that can make her one of the most difficult bosses in the series if not discovered first. If you go straight into the boss fight, then the arena will be filled with poison, which will not only constantly deplete your own health, but heal her, making the fight seem stupidly unfair and poorly designed. However, if you discover that by setting fire to this metal windmill, then it will shut off the poison production in the area and make the boss much more straightforward. After doing this, it's kind of just like fighting a regular enemy. The design is unique and eye-catching, but the fight is one of the most straightforward in the game of avoiding the same 3 spear attacks and countering. She is very passive, doesn't follow up attacks quickly, and has one of the most pathetic health bars of any boss in the series, all with a frustratingly limited moveset. They had one good idea, but it seems like they just left it at that and didn't bother developing the fight any further beyond the basic formatting difference. The mid-game of Dark Souls 2 is a bit of a slump when it comes to bosses. Huntsman's Copse and the Gutter are some of my favorite levels, but many of the bosses are definitely lacking in the mid-game. Royal Rat Vanguard compounds this even further. It is literally a room full of rats. the least threatening enemy in the game. All the fight consists of is killing time, waiting for the real boss to show up, and then he dies in 5 hits. Yeah. Once again, I give it points for uniqueness, but I can't believe this even made it into the game. The only good thing I can say about it is that it's easy. If you are going to have a badly designed boss, at least don't make it annoying. The final boss of the giant hole in the ground from Majula, the Rotten, is a fantastic boss thematically. The big hole in the ground leads to the gutter, essentially a trash pit where all of the junk of Drangleic is thrown. The Rotten represents this perfectly. Essentially, it's a giant pile of bodies and trash that has become sentient. The way they use 2 heads as eyes is very distinctive. Mechanically, it's not amazing, but it's certainly one of the better ones in the main game. He's got the usual fare of swiping as well as AoE and poison spit attacks. What does make the fight a little unique is the arena, in that there are these fire pits around the boss. It's supposed to be similar to the lava patches in Quelaag, but because these fire pits are stationary, they end up being mostly ineffective and only an occasional issue. Mostly, it's the visual design and the build-up that make this boss engaging instead of the mechanics. Looks a little familiar, right? Skin-deep comparisons aside, this fight has its own twist on the spatial challenge of Quelaag. Instead of lava covering the arena, Najka can instead go underneath the sand and spring up for a surprise attack. Your only refuge is the few stone spots in the arena which will block her from attacking. So yes, it's basically Tremors. The ideas in this fight I would put on par with Quelaag, but the execution is not nearly as sound. Quelaag was smartly positioned in the early game to be a pretty significant challenge, but Najka can be fought pretty close to the end of the game if you do the Shaded Woods last. She just doesn't have enough health, plain and simple. Her attacks are a little tricky with some delayed timings and windups, but none of that matters with healing windows as large as this and a health bar as puny as this. Najka is unfortunately guilty of missed potential. There's a very good core mechanic that could have been expanded into a more interesting fight, but like so many of this game's bosses, the ideas end up being stronger than the execution. Hey kids, did you like the Capra Demon? That's right, we'll step up and meet our new and improved version, the Royal Rat Authority. If you thought 2 dogs was fun, how about 4? And this time they're toxic too. Dying from an overpowered status effect sure is a hoot, right? This boss is a mess. If it weren't for the thankfully generous arena, this could have been the worst boss in the series. Dogs have always been an unsatisfying enemy to fight in this series because they have no telegraph for their attacks. They can just jump with no warning and with deceptive range, and giving them the ability to inflict toxic is a step too far. Like the Capra Demon, the beginning of this fight is a crapshoot of trying to survive the bullshit dogs, all with the actual boss causing trouble as well. Even trying to run to the other side of the arena and using a bow doesn't really work because they all aggro together. Once the dogs are dead, the fight is just a standard version of a beast boss fight. Stay on one of his sides and pick away at his ankles. That's it. He doesn't even have any rear attacks, so even after dealing with the annoying dogs, the fight isn't even interesting afterwards. Total Garbo trash represents the absolute worst of Dark Souls 2. To me, this fight is like the Royal Rat Vanguard if done properly. It's a group of smaller enemies and the actual boss surrounded and protected by them, but this time they aren't all the same enemy with the same attacks. The Prowling Magus is a spellcaster and is surrounded by 2 others as well as the horde of zombies with melee attacks. The Prowling Magus has an AoE as well as ranged attacks, which means that trying to ignore him at any range is very risky. Circling around and killing the weaker zombies while avoiding ranged attacks is the real challenge of this fight. This would be a really good little boss if it wasn't for the low enemy health. It's a shame how easy many of the mid-game bosses become after upgrading your weapon to a decent level. It's the opposite problem of the first game, where the first half of the game is balanced perfectly because it has to be done in a mostly linear order, but then the second half becomes way too easy when all 4 major bosses can be done in any order. Here, the first half of the game becomes way too easy, and then it gets harder later on. The design is solid, however, and that mostly makes up for the poor structuring. The Duke's Dear Freya is another fantastic fight visually and thematically, but kind of bland and mediocre mechanically. The arena, the bottom of a massive cascading spiderweb, is beautiful, and the 2-headed design of the spider is grotesque and unusual. The fight itself mostly consists of running back and forth between the 2 heads to score damage, and avoiding the smaller spiders around the arena. Unlike the Royal Rat Authority, these minor enemies are so weak and ineffective that they are barely even worth mentioning, so they aren't a major annoyance. The Freya itself is the real concern, whose attacks are unpredictable and extremely damaging. Its forward thrust has deceptive timing and wide range, and it can even shoot a laser, just with very generous telegraphing and windup. But none of this can be feared from a boss as passive as this. Huge damage and costly mistakes are part of the Dark Souls formula, but it only works if follow-up attacks make healing a risky proposition. The Freya is content to sit around and wait patiently, only doing an attack when it can be asked. It's this severe lack of aggression that ends up being the Achilles heel for so many of the mid-game Dark Souls 2 bosses. The healing animation is the slowest in the series, but when the bosses let you get away with it time after time, it doesn't even matter. I normally save the Iron Keep for last because of one boss. The Smelter Demon is one of the hardest bosses in the main game of Dark Souls 2. The reasons that make him such vary from fair and well considered to absolutely broken. The good thing that makes this fight challenging is his windups and telegraphs for attacks. They are varied and confusing. Sometimes he will delay his attack for just a second, and other times he will attack within a few frames of the windup. It's extremely challenging until you learn the tells, and it makes it feel unpredictable and satisfying to learn compared to most of the other bosses. Then there's the thing I'm kind of in the middle on. When he reaches his second stage, he'll start doing an aura of fire damage. This means that no shield, no dodging will help you. You will constantly be taking damage when in melee range, so if you aren't a sorcerer, it's going to be a considerable amount of non-avoidable damage. If this was Dark Souls 1, this would be unforgivable because you have a fixed amount of healing. Since this is Dark Souls 2 and life gems are a thing, it's more forgivable but still annoying. And then there's the bad part of this fight. While the varying speed of attacks make him a fair challenge, the hitboxes certainly don't. The Smelter Demon has some of the most broken hitboxes in the game. I say broken and not unfair because sometimes they will work and sometimes this will happen. It's inconsistent and incredibly frustrating, and it drags this boss down more than it should. Inconsistent damage does not gel well with constant unavoidable damage either, so there is a lot of damage that is just going to happen in this fight. Despite that, the design is so superb when it comes to the moveset that I still enjoy it more than most in the main game. Wow, this boss looks scary. Unfortunately, despite the threatening appearance, this boss is a joke. His attacks consist of very slow slamming attacks and fire breath. He leaves himself open for absolutely forever after attacks and has a shockingly low amount of health for what is supposed to be a fallen king made a god out of the iron of his kingdom. Thankfully, this is the last mediocre mid-game boss we'll be discussing as we now begin entering the end game. Okay, that's not entirely true. Yeah, it's a rehash of an earlier boss, but at least it's a little different. It's not simply two Dragon Riders, but one is an archer, and the other is the normal Dragon Rider fought earlier in the game. You can keep both in view and dodge the arrows like a standard duel against multiples, or bait the melee rider into breaking the platform for the archer, bringing them both down to your level. It's not difficult or hugely impressive, but it's a decent fight. The first truly great boss in Dark Souls 2 is the Looking Glass Knight. The arena for this boss is suitably dramatic, taking place during a lightning storm, and the knight will incorporate the inclement weather into his attacks. Otherwise, he has a pretty standard moveset of short combos and jump attacks, except for one attack that makes him completely unique among Dark Souls bosses to this point. When he reaches half health, he'll drop his shield to the ground and summon a real player if they left their summon sign around the area or a hostile NPC. The challenge varies enormously depending on how good the player summoned is or if the NPC gets summoned. The NPC is much easier because they can very easily be stun locked to death. I was not able to get an actual player summoned on this playthrough, but I have in the past, and it confirmed the huge variance in enjoyment for this fight. Originally, he summoned, no joke, Dark Sniper Assassin Wolf Ninja 42069 or something like that, and I'm pretty sure they were hacking because they ran to a corner of the arena and spammed unlimited Fire Tempest and Fire Snake, and the knight summoned them 3 times in a row. The second stage of the fight can be significantly difficult depending on who gets summoned, but the knight seems to become less aggressive and rely on heavily telegraphed range attacks to make it a little more fair. So my first experience was not the greatest, but on subsequent playthroughs, I do consider this one of the best in the main game. Another really unique boss visually that is pretty standard and mediocre mechanically. The visual design of this thing is great. It's like a giant frog with distinctly human-like face and arms. Its body is completely resistant to damage, and it has an eyelid type thing that can cover his entire face to protect it from damage. Despite the memorable visual design, mechanically, all the fight really consists of is waiting for it to open and then do a swiping attack and counter. It does have one extremely dangerous ranged attack, but it doesn't do it very often, and it's not aggressive enough with follow-up attacks to be much of an issue. This would be a pretty awful fight if it wasn't for the unique visual design, and that does its best to carry it. The Royal Protector of Vendrick takes the crown for the best boss fight in the main game in my opinion. This fight has so much going for it. The palpable atmosphere of fighting deep into the pitch black royal crypts, the amazing sound design, both the fantastic score, the distinct sound of Velstat's bell smashing against the ground, and the design of the fight itself, which is one of the strongest in the series so far. My only gripe is that I wish he had more health, or maybe a more exciting second stage that could prolong the fight and make it more challenging to endurance. As it stands, he hits hard but slow, and his attacks are very generously telegraphed. It's like fighting a boss version of Havel without being able to parry. Velstat has a good variety of attacks, from the usual sweeps and thrusts to dark magic in his second phase. Most of these are pretty straightforward, but he has one attack that is a serious threat and very easy to underestimate. This attack, where he can both jump backwards and score a hit in a couple of frames, is near impossible to dodge without knowing it's coming, and can easily knock off a good chunk of health. Some people don't like this fight as much because his attacks are very slow, but I think that works in this boss's favor. The amount of damage Velstat can dish out in a single hit is massive. Every swing of the hammer is a potential death in a more direct and threatening way than most bosses in the game. I just wish he had a larger health pool to challenge endurance more directly. The longer the fight would go on, the more tense it would get as the player understands how costly a single screw up can be. Fantastic, best boss of the main game. The Guardian Dragon has the setup to be one of the best bosses in the game. He's the area boss of one of the best areas in Dark Souls 2, Aldia's Keep. His arena is uncharacteristically gorgeous, with light filtering through the bars of a giant cage, and he's comparable in size to Calamite. But despite the stellar presentation, this is one of the weaker dragon fights in the series, and one of the weaker fights in Dark Souls 2, period. Mechanically, he is ridiculously limited with only a couple of ground attacks, a stomp, and a very ineffective swipe. The rest of this fight is a laborious waste of time as he hops up to the bars to spit easily avoidable fireballs or fire breath at you. It's boring and isn't challenging in the least. Even though they nailed the look of this boss, the boss theme is shockingly bad. This is as exciting as it gets. The music is generally great for bosses, but this is just so rushed and so flat. I don't know how this fight ended up going this wrong besides either laziness or lack of time, but it's a real shame that this ended up wasting so much potential. There is only 2 bosses in the whole series that I could not be bothered to get the kill for in this video. This is one of them. I got this footage, but that's all I got, and there is no way in hell I'm about to run the bullshit gauntlet of Dragon Shrine for the 40th time just to get to this boss. This boss is terrible. Thankfully it's optional, but that is no excuse for the worst designed dragon boss in the series, and one of the worst boss fights thus far. The Ancient Dragon is the first dragon in the series to be truly intimidating in size. Calamite and the Guardian Dragon were about on Sif's scale for comparison. They were big for sure, but they never gave off the impression of an ancient and powerful creature like the Ancient Dragon does. It looks so intimidating and so suitably ancient. It's also the first dragon boss in the series not tethered to the ground or a cage like Calamite and the Guardian Dragon were. This boss is free to fly around and do whatever freeform powerful attacks a dragon can do, except he doesn't do any of that. All this boss does is very lazily slow stomp attacks, fire breath, or hover above the ground and spray fire underneath him, and that's it. It's one of the most limited boss movesets of the series. I'm not even joking when I say that many of the regular enemies have more moves than this main boss does. Making matters even worse, every one of his attacks does enough damage to kill a high-level player in 1 or 2 hits. The stomps and flame breath are very easy to avoid, so no problem there, but the hovering flame attack has so much range that unless you start running the exact second he's about to leave the ground, you are going to take damage from it. The dragon loves to spam this move over and over again too, which drags the fight out way longer than it should. On top of all of this, he has the biggest health bar of any boss in the game. This boss is a combination of all of the worst elements possible that synchronize terribly and make this the most tedious and frustrating boss in the entire series to this point. Spending a good 7 minutes hacking away at his ankles only to die from 1 hit from the flying flame attack, and then having to run all the way back through this bullshit gauntlet of overpowered enemies blocking the way, and then starting all over is nothing but a chore and a huge missed opportunity. With the Ancient Dragon, they finally have a base to design the perfect dragon fight around, the perfect size and the perfect health bar to really demonstrate the futility of fighting such an ancient and powerful thing, but they absolutely ruined this fight with a horribly limited moveset, ambiguous attacks, and one of the worst boss runs in the series so far. For shame. This boss is absolutely excellent, so that's why it's so confusing that they chose to make it an optional boss locked behind a covenant and a bunch of awkwardly balanced PvP style fights against NPCs. This is the best multi-boss fight in the series so far from a mechanical perspective. The first stage is against a single Dark Lurker, allowing you to learn his very unpredictable but devastating attacks. His magic attacks are insanely damaging and can easily stunlock a high-level character to death, and his melee strikes are not only telegraphed very unnaturally, but do massive amounts of damage if landed. Once he splits into 2 is when the fight really begins though. Instead of 2 very different bosses or 3 of the same boss with a fairly limited moveset, this is the first time fighting 2 versions of the same boss with a complicated and varied moveset. Both of the Dark Lurkers will alternate between magic and melee attacks during the fight. This easily has the potential to become annoying and unbalanced with 2 very powerful and threatening bosses crossing over attacks in a confined area. What makes this work is the very slow and deliberate telegraphing of the magic attacks and the huge enemy health bar. The balance is just perfect. It's an intense challenge, but a totally fair and thrilling one. The huge damage of attacks means that mistakes are costly but avoidable with enough situational awareness and skill. I only have one negative thing to say, and it's this damn rock towards the entrance in the arena that I always get stuck on. This loathsome little thing is responsible for so many deaths. I could take a shower in the amount of human effigies it took to take this boss down on my first playthrough. But that is a minor, very personal gripe, and I don't count it against this boss. Easily the best multi-boss fight in the series, and one of the best period. The Giant Lord is basically just the last giant with a sword. I don't have a lot to say about him other than it takes place in the endgame Giants memories, which are way more interesting than this boss is. Dark Souls 2 has a different approach for its Fallen King. I'm split on this one. The reveal of Vendrick as a hollow shell endlessly circling the black tomb of his own making is striking and even more tragic than Gwyn, but then there's the actual fight itself. It's just bad. I get it, they wanted to make him seem like someone so broken that all he does is lazily slash his sword around, but it doesn't have the complexity of Gwyn. Gwyn was clearly fallen and a shadow of his former self, but that former self was still there. He could still fight, it was just painfully evident how much his fighting had regressed. Vendrick's moveset might not have been so bad if they put in some extra effort. Maybe he will fall over, similar to the Iron Golem after a couple hits, and then uncaringly flail his sword around while laying on the ground or something. Or they could have just made him weaker, because for some reason they decided to give him the most ridiculous health bar of any boss in the game. Vendrick's health bar is tied to giant souls that can be found in the Giant's memories or from the Ancient Dragon. The more souls you have during the fight, the less health he has. If you try and fight him with no giant souls, then you'd better have about 50 repair powders with you because it's going to take a while. I love what they did with the presentation in this fight, even if it is retreading old ideas, but it's a shame they didn't put more effort into making the actual fight reinforce that presentation. The first DLC boss for Crown of the Sunken King is a great one. Alana is another really good multi-boss fight that has some interesting twists on the formula. Like Dark Lurker, she alternates between magic and melee attacks in the first stage to let the player learn her moves before things get crazy. When she enters her second stage, there is a bit of RNG involved in who she can summon. It can either be a group of skeletons or Velstadt, the best boss in the main game. Velstadt is the more difficult of the two, but absolutely the more fun option. Once Velstadt is spawned, it turns this boss into one of the best multi-boss fights in the series. Their attacks are very well balanced and synchronized fairly and satisfyingly. Alana's magic attacks are telegraphed generously, and Velstadt's strikes are the same from the boss fight with him earlier. Very deliberate and beautifully telegraphed. It's a great challenge and a fun one to bait out attacks from Velstadt and whittle Alana down over time. The next few bosses are for the 3 DLCs, and Alana is an early indication as to just how much they improved over the boss design from the main game. But after saying that, I have to talk about the worst part of the DLC, which ends up not only being the worst thing about Dark Souls 2, but the entire series, Dark Souls 3 included, the atrocious co-op areas. There's one thankfully optional co-op area in each DLC that contains its own optional boss. This could have been a well-considered addition that improved an aspect of the game that hadn't been represented so far. What it ended up being is a contest to throw as many enemies as they can in a linear hallway that leads straight to the boss. Never has a boss run been so appropriately named, because look at this mess. There really is no point in fighting any of this, so that makes it all the more confusing it was conceived at all. Anyways, once you finally get past that horrible thing, the boss itself isn't any good either. It's another triple boss, but instead of being carefully designed like the Ruined Sentinels where they can be fought individually if done fast enough, they just threw 3 already existing NPCs in a room and said fuck it. The fact that they are NPCs and not uniquely designed boss enemies is not only lazily designed visually, but a horrendous balancing decision mechanically. The hostile NPCs in Dark Souls have always been annoying to fight. They don't seem to share any of the restrictions the player does and can dance around with infinite stamina. Having to fight 3 at once is not only unfair, but feels sloppy. It's more about exploiting the AI and using the arena than countering a varied moveset. The only advantage given to the player is the arena, which they can drop down and circle around to try and split them up momentarily. And the most depressing thing is that while this fight is a shitfest, it's actually the best of the 3 co-op bosses in these DLCs. Finally the series has a great dragon boss fight. Sin the Slumbering Dragon is a near perfect dragon boss. He's got a varied and threatening moveset. On the ground, he has multiple defenses built in for abusing sides and back, both with a flaming attack reaching on either side and a tail swipe that he can even combo for huge damage. He has one of the best boss themes in the series. And in a series first, he's a dragon that actually has a fun and varied moveset in the air as well as on the ground. Diving attacks, fireballs, and huge AoE fire breath, and all of his leaping and smashing around the arena will destroy all of the scenery, really making it feel climactic and powerful in a way no other dragon boss has managed to do thus far. The only minor gripe I have with his moveset is the opening charge attack, where he just sort of moves forward immediately without any clear telegraph. It looks like he's about to swipe his head to the side, but it's hard to tell when he'll move forward so dramatically. Otherwise, the only thing that keeps this fight from being perfect is his health and his size. This is another Calamite-sized dragon with a relatively low health bar for a being such as this. Now don't get me wrong, he's still got a massive health pool, big enough to where my weapon actually almost broke and I had to fumble around in the menus mid-fight to repair it. But it still doesn't feel like something completely beyond any reasonable measure like an ancient dragon should. But that's it. Other than that, this is easily the best dragon boss in the series so far, and one of the best fights in the series period, Dark Souls 3 included. What most consider to be the most difficult boss in Dark Souls 2 is the Fume Knight, the mandatory boss of the Crown of the Old Iron King DLC. While I've never found that an appropriate mantle myself, this also is easily one of the best bosses in the whole series. When it comes to aggression and damage output in Dark Souls 2, Fume Knight is unmatched. Mistakes are costly in Dark Souls as a rule, but this boss takes that even further. He can easily kill a high-level character in just 2 hits on his second phase, and he leaves so little time for healing that baiting out attacks long enough for a heal becomes the primary concern for much of the fight. If you've got your dodging on point, then this boss is a real treat. His attacks are immaculately telegraphed and thrilling to avoid, but I think the reason most players find this boss so difficult is because of a reliance on shields. I have a feeling Fume Knight was specifically designed to punish shield-reliant players because he can easily bash through a high-level character's stamina in just a couple hits, as well as doing fire damage that can go through blocked hits. This fight is about patience above all else. His rapid, lengthy combos on phase 1 will eat through much of your stamina, and he will immediately punish greed. For the first time since Artorias, it becomes insanely risky to go for more than 1 or 2 hits at a time, and that is just so refreshing in the midst of Dark Souls 2's generally sloppy, slow bosses. His attacks in phase 1 are a mixture of immediate and super delayed to try and throw off the player's dodge timings, and his attacks in phase 2 range from absurdly fast and deadly to extremely damaging and slow ranged attacks. The reason I don't find him all that difficult personally is because this fight is absolutely fair and balanced, and that makes the Fume Knight one of the best in the game. I go back and forth between Sir Alon and a certain other boss as my favorite in Dark Souls 2. Sir Alon is the best fight in the game from a purely mechanical perspective. Fighting Sir Alon with no shield, no buffs, just 2 warriors battling it out is the most tense and exciting fight in the whole of Dark Souls 2. Fights in the series come to get increasingly more complicated and varied, but Sir Alon is the purest duel between 2 equals in the entire series. This might be a little confusing on first glance. Sir Alon's attacks are pretty straightforward. Piercing attacks, long distance sweeps, close range combos, jump attacks, and a special move where he can curse you with a protracted piercing animation. Nothing about these attacks are all that extraordinary, and yet I find this one of the most difficult fights in the series. The reason for that, and the reason that makes Sir Alon a brilliant fight, is the timings of these attacks. Most bosses in the series have a standard for attack timings. Fume Knight's combo here, for example, is the same animation every time with the same timings to memorize. Sir Alon has the same animations but can vary the timings for each attack during the fight without telegraphing a change in speed. This makes him unpredictable and requires intense study of the animations. The long distance sweep in particular is very unpredictable and challenging to avoid. It can vary between extremely fast, only a few frames of reaction time, to delayed and so slow that it can easily catch you at the end of your roll if you reflexively dodge at the beginning of the animation. And like Fume Knight before him, he can easily kill you in just 2 hits, making this really feel like a duel between 2 samurai. No protection between them, just 2 swords clashing under the rising sun. The presentation is also some of the strongest in the series. Alon's arena is the top of a tower with the sun illuminated in the background on a mirrored marble floor. And the music, ugh! Maybe my favorite boss theme in the series. This would be a perfect boss fight if it wasn't for one thing. It has the single worst boss run in the series. Oh my god, look how many knights there are. It's a lazy straight gauntlet filled with fire-spitting lizards and so many Alon Knights that they will literally clog the tight hallways until they are all dispatched. And you have to run this stupid thing every time you die, which for me is a lot. If they put a bonfire right outside this boss door, this fight would be perfect. The fight itself is so good that I can't count it against this boss too much. It's with Sir Alon and the Fume Knight that Dark Souls starts putting a very noticeable amount of effort into its bosses. Even the best fights in Dark Souls 1, Ornstein and Smaug and Artorias still feel lesser compared to the polish and the challenge of Dark Souls 2's DLC. Okay, so you know how I said Sir Alon had the worst boss run in the series? I lied. The Iron Passage is unequivocally the most frustrating, lazy, and poorly designed section in the series, Dark Souls 3 included. Everything people say about Dark Souls 2, that its linear hallways of Gankfest design manifests itself in this fucking run. It is literally 3 straight hallways of enemies, some of which are normal melee enemies, some of which are archers, and some of which are unreachable sorcerers who put a fucking slow spell on you that restricts your rolling. What the fuck? It's like they're trying to be as annoying as possible. This run is indefensible straight garbage, and I have nothing nice to say about it. The excuse is that this is a co-op area and meant to be done with a party of players, but I say, what about in 10 years when the online community is dead? So what happens once you finally make it through this dreadful thing? Oh, for fuck's sakes. It's just Smelter Demon again, only he's blue, and he has even more broken hitboxes. This is the hardest fight in the game for me, not because it's challenging, but because I am convinced it is broken. So many times during this fight I would get hit and have no idea what I could have done differently. I had my agility at 96 at this point, so I wasn't dealing with the default iframes, and this shit was still happening. And every time you die, you have to run the gauntlet of enemies again. I could not take this boss. I caved and eventually committed a cardinal sin by summoning just so that I could get the footage of beating him. Are you happy now? The first boss of the Ivory King DLC is an interesting one with some unique mechanics. You can enter this fight immediately upon starting the DLC just to find an invisible tiger messing you up. It's actually to teach you to explore the area first and find an item that reveals invisible enemies, but it's kind of unique that they teach you this through death. Once Ava is revealed, it's a mostly standard beast fight just with some unique moves and twists to timings. Ava has ranged attacks, a rare thing for a beast boss, but they end up being easily avoidable and more useful as a healing window than anything really threatening. His melee attacks, however, are the complete opposite. Ava's melee attacks are some of the hardest to dodge in the game, with his trademark delay after he rears back on either his left or right paw for a sweep. It's designed perfectly to bait out a reflexive roll from the player and then catch them off guard. It's very tricky to nail down at first and does considerable damage. Ava's speed is a little surprising as well, being able to jump a good distance of the arena and spin around to attack his backside. It's a pretty challenging and well-designed boss that channels difficulty from some underutilized areas in this series so far. Okay, so you know how I said the Cave of the Dead was the worst boss run in this series, and then I said the Iron Passage was the worst? I lied again. I'm amending that for the third and the last time, I swear. I declare once and for all that the Frigid Outskirts is the biggest piece of shit that I have ever played in my life. A cool idea is ruined spectacularly by the complete absence of bonfires and the single worst designed enemy in the entire series in the form of electric reindeer. Sounds cool, but it's really not. They have a charge attack that is impossible to dodge. Nope. I don't think it's possible. They are also faster than you, so running is pointless, and they will relentlessly spam the unavoidable charge attack over and over again if you do attempt to fight them, making it a grueling, sloppy mess of spamming the attack button and praying to the gods that they will just die before you succumb to the onslaught of broken charge attacks. Dealing with one of them may be doable, but of course not. You have to run a marathon across a barren plain with no vision, constantly getting ambushed along the way, eventually ending with 2 of them at once. And this is all just to get to the damn boss, which turns out to be 2 Avas. So not only is the run to the boss the most challenging thing in the entire series for stupid reasons, but the boss at the end is a terrible, unbalanced reskin with attacks that do not gel together in a satisfying or fair way. This is the only boss in the entire series besides the Ancient Dragon that I did not kill for this video. This is the only footage I got. I physically cannot stand any more of this area before I start breaking things, so this is it. Call it unprofessional or whatever you want. This boss and this area can go fuck itself. I officially amend my previous statement and give Lud and Zolan the worst boss of all time award and the Frigid Outskirts the award for legally sanctioned torture. The developers should be ashamed, and I will do them a favor by pretending it does not exist for the rest of this video. This is how the Dark Souls DLCs work, because we go from the worst to the best in all of Dark Souls 2. My favorite overall boss in Dark Souls 2 and in the series to this point is the Burnt Ivory King. Sir Alon is purer in its design and isn't as sloppy, but the Burnt Ivory King has things going for it that Sir Alon doesn't. This boss has got it all. It's got the lore, it's got the challenge, and it's got the spectacle, and oh what a spectacle it is. First you get this gratifying shot of seeing all the Loist Knights you found preparing for battle, and then this perfectly timed and transitioned fall into the old chaos itself with you and your squad of knights. I'm not going to get super in-depth for the lore, but I think the Ivory King's story is important to this boss's impact. That's because the Ivory King is one of the most memorable and tragic characters in the whole series. Ilium Loist, the city the Ivory King built, is a fortress to contain the old chaos, and the portal to which resides in the throne room of the king himself, just so that he can personally watch over it and will be the first line of defense. Eventually he led a squad of knights into the old chaos and gave his own soul to quarantine the chaos in the fortress he built to protect his people and the outside world from his flames. The fight you now partake in is unabashedly epic. Gathering the fallen king's lost knights and venturing into the chaos to defeat the twisted versions of the knights and the king himself that were consumed by the chaos all that time ago. The first stage of the fight is the ultimate test of fighting groups of heavily armored soldiers that Dark Souls 2 mostly consists of. They can't be backstabbed like normal enemies and have infinite poise. By taking away two of your most useful exploits, it makes you rely totally on your allied Loist Knights and makes it an incredible challenge. The knights will gradually fall one by one, sacrificing themselves to shut off the portals that spawn charred Loist Knights until the king himself shows up in the coolest boss intro in the series so far. I just wish that the Ivory King was more challenging. What makes this fight so interesting is that right after defeating Ava, you can start this boss almost immediately afterward with only one Loist Knight. That, however, makes it one of the hardest, if not the hardest fights in the game because you'll be swarmed with enemy Charred Knights the entire fight. But the balance shifts too far in the other direction if you have gotten all of the knights. By the end, you can still have allied knights alive for the boss. I think this is the first fight in the entire series where you can actually outnumber the boss without summoning, and it can unfortunately make the fight too easy. I said after my first playthrough. A lot of people think this boss is really easy, and I agreed with them after I beat him first try on my first playthrough. However, on the playthrough for this video, he absolutely messed me up 5 times in a row. There seems to be a fair amount of RNG. The first time I fought him, he just repeated the fairly easily avoidable charge attack over and over again, but this time, he changed the speed of his attacks the same way Sir Alon does on a whim. It caught me off guard and was a struggle to adjust to. Now after fighting him on this playthrough and seeing the whole range of his attacks, a huge damage grab and AoE attack, I enjoy this fight even more than I did before. Eventually he'll buff his sword, which turns into a lightsaber basically, and then he has both speed and range that takes full advantage of the large open platform. The second stage of this boss turns into a much more deadly version of Artorias. He has incredible speed, but with the huge range of his buffed sword, healing windows become minuscule, and trying to create space becomes impossible. Ultimately, though, it's the presentation that elevates this boss to something else. It truly is next level for the Souls series. It outclasses every boss in the series in that way, even going all the way to the end of Dark Souls 3 before it's finally topped, and we'll get there. The Burnt Ivory King is a fantastic way to cap off the brilliant Crown DLCs for Dark Souls 2 and is a vanguard for the more complicated boss design to come later. The final 3 bosses of Dark Souls 2 have to be fought in succession, making it a real endurance fight with one life. The first is an homage to Ornstein and Smaug, only not quite as remarkable. Throne Watcher and Throne Defender are similar, with one wielding a speedy spear-type weapon and another with a slower greatsword. The difference is that this fight absolutely has to be played defensively, much more so than Ornstein and Smaug, because they aren't content to throw out an attack or two at a time, instead resorting to sweeping combos. If you are caught in the middle of both at once, it is almost a guaranteed death, or at the very least a huge loss in total health. Instead, it is maybe the greatest test of patience in the game, very carefully baiting out 1 or 2 attacks at a time. They both have shields as well, a further defense against player aggression. When either of them reaches low health, they will buff their sword, giving them even more damage than before, making it one of the riskiest fights in the game. Unlike Ornstein and Smaug, however, when one falls, the other doesn't absorb their power and start over. They are dead for good, and the remaining is a much more feasible 1v1. Actually, they can revive their fallen comrade, but after a very long amount of time, so it's not too much of an issue. It's a very solid fight, all things considered, and a great way to close out the game. Extremely well balanced and tense. The second boss in this sequence is less so. In fact, it's kind of a flop. Nashandra was originally the final boss of Dark Souls 2 before Scholar of the First Sin, and I can see how that certainly left a poor impression. Nashandra is very similar to Alana, just without the interesting attacks or ability to summon help, so pretty much worthless. The only real unique thing about this fight is that Nashandra puts little curse orbs around the arena to incentivize patience, but because curse is nerfed so hard compared to the first game, it's actually easier to just tank it and wail away at the very passive Nashandra until she's dead. There's not much of a strategy or much of a challenge. It's uncompromisingly bland and hugely disappointing given that it was the original final boss. But with the Scholar of the First Sin edition, it patched in one final fight to cap off the trio of bosses guarding the Throne of Want. It's not successful in terms of mechanics, being maybe even less complex than Nashandra, but it is very successful thematically and in its presentation. Aldia is a character that shows up throughout the whole game, asking and challenging the player about what they plan to do once they reach the throne, so it's fitting that he rounds out the end bosses. And the boss theme is great. Aldia can't measure up to Gwyn and is no doubt pretty bland mechanically, but I can't bring myself to dislike this one because of the stellar presentation. When I think about it, that describes a lot of bosses in Dark Souls 2. And while I controversially do think that Dark Souls 2 has better individual level design than Dark Souls 1, it both regressed in several key areas unfortunately, and drastically improved when it comes to the boss design. Now Dark Souls 1 was not even close to perfect either, but while the amount of good bosses has shot up dramatically, the amount of bad ones has shot up as well, making Dark Souls 2's selection a disappointing mixed bag of some of the best fights in the series and some of the biggest missed potential. Dark Souls 3 has a radically different approach to bosses in the first two games. The first two, especially Dark Souls 2, were frequently outshined by the levels the bosses took place in. The level design is the Souls series' defining trait when compared to the bosses, which some of the time felt like an afterthought. Dark Souls 3 changes this. It puts much more emphasis on the bosses than past titles, and the end result is easily the best boss lineup of all 3 games. There is a proper difficulty curve this time instead of the mid-game sag in Dark Souls 2 or the late-game sag in 1. Bosses actually have a reasonable amount of health and feel properly balanced throughout the entire thing. Bosses in Dark Souls 3 share a new rule that gives boss fights more variety and depth. Whenever a boss reaches half health, they will enter a second, and most of the time a much more deadly stage where they gain new attacks or abilities that change the entire dynamic of the fight and give bosses a consistent sense of variety and tension that was never fully realized in past games. The first boss of Dark Souls 3 for the first time in the series is actually really good. The Asylum Demon was okay, and the Last Giant was less than okay. Udex Gundyr is not only a good teaching tool, but a very solid and satisfying fight on its own that's even fun for returning players. The first stage is a very well done standard duel against a big knight with a big weapon. Immediately, Dark Souls 3 starts showing off its differences in design with 3 changes. Gundyr is fast. Much faster than most enemies in previous games. It can be a little difficult to adjust to coming straight off of Dark Souls 2, but it's a welcome change, giving the game a faster pace than the extremely slow and deliberate pace of Dark Souls 2. And secondly, Gundyr can actually be parried. One of the most disappointing things about the Dark Souls 1 and 2 bosses was the lack of bringing in the special moves used against regular enemies like backstabs and parries. In Dark Souls 1, only Gwyn was parryable. In Dark Souls 2, many more of the bosses could be parried, but I'm crap at parrying in Dark Souls 2, so I mostly stayed away from it. In Dark Souls 3, almost every humanoid boss can be parried, even if they are too big to be riposted. It adds an extra element to bosses where very skilled timing can land huge damage. And finally, Gundyr will enter his second stage when a huge black growth will sprout out of him and turn the fight into a much sloppier but admittedly intimidating and intense fight. The attacks are very difficult to see coming, and the size is so ridiculous that the camera can cause issues, but the shock value makes it kind of work. It's a little disappointing that the first stage ends up being hugely more mechanically satisfying, but it's still a teaching tool at the end of the day, and at that, the Ashen Judge excels. The first proper boss in Dark Souls 3 is Vort of the Boreal Valley, a dog-like mace wielder on all fours. What characterizes Vort and others from the Boreal Valley is their unnatural beast-like movements that can be tricky to predict. He has varied timings from extremely delayed sweeps to near instant smashdowns. His large size actually works in his favor too, because he isn't content to let the player wail away on his sides. He is extremely mobile and aggressive and will constantly be turning to face the player head on. In that situation, it's very easy to get stuck or lose track of where you are. It's this quality that's the worst part of the fight. Otherwise, it's visually distinctive and decently balanced, but it can be very clunky and awkward like what happens in this playthrough. His second stage is a lot more exciting when he starts rampaging around the arena and using Frostbite AoE spells, a new status effect, but the same sloppiness remains. It's an okay fight, all things considered. I just wish the camera could pull back a bit more for this fight and maybe ease up a bit on the collision detection. I give this boss points for uniqueness because it has a different way of damaging it than any other boss in the series. Similar to Demon of Song, its body is a hard shell and does not take any damage, but instead of attacking the head, the Greatwood has little pustules located in different spots around the body. After these are hit a few times, they will pop and take off a large chunk of health. So the fight becomes less about abusing the large size by hiding on one of the sides or the back, because this might be the largest boss in the series in terms of size. Instead, the goal is to hunt down each of the little pustules and do enough damage to them at the same time that the tree is moving all over the place and dealing with the hollows in the first stage. After enough damage is dealt, the floor will break through and the tree gains many more moves, including an arm that attacks from the front and a bunch of lazily rolling around or standing up and then sitting right down huge damage attacks. Otherwise, the fight is largely the same with just avoiding more attacks. I think this says a lot about how good Dark Souls 3 is when it comes to bosses, because while this is one of the weaker ones, it's still better than a lot in the first 2 games. A very short and simple little boss on the way to the cathedral, the Crystal Sage is a sorcerer who has a couple of very high damage, slow moving spells and will teleport to a different corner of the arena after taking enough damage. This boss is a total pushover and one of the easiest in the game. All the first phase really consists of is dodging a spell or two and then stun locking this sage into submission before he teleports away, just to repeat the same thing over and over again. In the second phase, things get a little more interesting when the sage clones themselves, but the real one is easily identified by the purple spells, and the fake ones die in one hit. The only real way to lose to this boss is by being too overly passive on the second phase and getting overwhelmed by the spells cast by all of the fakes. Otherwise, this is one of, if not the easiest and least remarkable bosses in the game. He can even be parried, which just makes it all the more hilariously easy. This is another contender for easiest boss in the game, but instead of the Crystal Sage, which was just kind of boring, this boss is gorgeously atmospheric and unique. The Deacons are a tightly packed group of individually weak and relatively passive normal enemies protecting a possessed Deacon that damages the actual health bar. After the possessed Deacon is killed, another will quickly be possessed in his place and repeat. It's pretty fun actually, trying to cut through the herd. Strength weapons like a Zweihänder really come into their own here, as you can knock down almost the entire group with a single swing. After the boss reaches half health, a new Deacon spawns that remains as the permanently possessed Deacon and gains a new group of linebacker bodyguards. This phase is very similar to the first, only it can be fairly easy to focus in on the possessed Deacon too heavily and fail to notice the Deacons on the sides casting a curse spell which will instantly kill you if it manages to build up. The linebackers are a little more aggressive than the normal Deacons too, so it's a little more challenging to get to the possessed Deacon. This to me is an example of a unique boss done mostly right. It's not super challenging, but its uniqueness doesn't become annoying or change the core gameplay too drastically. Instead, it manages to challenge a different set of the player's ability than most other bosses. An early game highlight, the Abyss Watchers are one of the more memorable and unique bosses in Dark Souls 3. This is a multi-boss fight done very differently than anything done before. It starts off similar to the Ruin Sentinels, putting you against a single Abyss Watcher before more spawn on timers later. They play very much like a regular enemy, extremely fast and agile, and also perceptible to special attacks like backstabs and parries that most bosses are immune to. They even have poise and can be stun locked. After a certain amount of time though, another will spawn in. Dealing with two at once is much more difficult because of how quickly they can close huge distances around the arena. The fight becomes much more defensive and about patiently waiting for an opening, but instead of a third Abyss Watcher spawning in and making the fight a 3v1 similar to Ruin Sentinels, the third that spawns in is actually aggressive towards both you and the other Abyss Watchers. So instead of having to deal with 3 extremely fast and aggressive enemies at once, you can pull away just the one while the other 2 will be fighting each other, allowing more damage against a single target. This cycle will repeat infinitely until the original Abyss Watcher is dead, meaning that the tables can turn in the Watcher's favor again should the Red-Eyed Watcher die. After the original Watcher is dead, the fight becomes much more straightforward, but also much more challenging. Now the fight is against a single Watcher with a sword covered in flames that will leave flame trails all around his strikes, sometimes dealing damage even if properly avoiding the majority of the strike. The Watcher has the most agile and ridiculously cool moveset of the entire series up to this point, able to combo strike after strike, doing backflips and breakdancing on the ground while throwing fire everywhere. It's gorgeous and very difficult to avoid. The Watcher's weakness is still his ability to be backstabbed and poise broken, so the player can cause huge damage after baiting out enough attacks. The Abyss Watchers is one of the best takes on a multi-boss fight in the series to date, which manages to strike a solid balance between being fair and still being a challenge. Picking up after the failure that was the Demon Ruins and Lost Izalith, we have the first good demon boss in the series. I don't count the Smelter Demon, he's more of another Knight style boss. The old Demon King actually has a varied moveset with some scary powerful fire spells as well as delayed melee attacks. The first phase is similar to fighting the mini-boss version of this creature back in the Undead Settlement. He leaves large windows open for attack, but does crazy damage if an attack lands, and it's easier than it looks for that to happen. His attacks are the most challenging kind of delayed, where they will catch you at the end of your roll if you roll too early. He also mixes this up with some super quick fire spells meant to catch you off guard, preparing for the slower melee strikes. However, it's the second phase that this fight becomes much more daunting with some of the most unique and threatening fire spells the series has to offer. The first is this massive nuke that he conjures above him that spits multiple exploding fireballs that home in on the player. If you don't know what this spell does initially, it can easily instant kill a proper leveled character for this boss. Thankfully, you can hide behind the stacks of bodies in the arena to avoid this one, but if you are caught out in the open, it is absolutely devastating. The other attack isn't as powerful, but is much harder to avoid. It's when he hits the ground repeatedly, sending out a ring of fire that has to be rolled through. This is trickier than it looks, and it even comes back from behind after the initial strike, which might be enough to kill a weakened player at this point. Otherwise, it's the standard fare of melee strikes to mix up the fight and a couple of improved AoEs. The only problem with this fight is that it's a little clunky. His weapon is so big that he can actually throw you around the arena without actually doing any damage if you are caught. And similar to Vort, it's too easy to get stuck on his front side between animations. Beyond those minor nitpicks, this is the first good demon boss in the series and does a good job utilizing its arena and spells. I've done some questioning about the easiest boss in Dark Souls 3 a couple times so far, and while a couple of the others get close, it's really no contest who takes the crown in my opinion, and fittingly, it's High Lord Wolnir, the area boss of the Catacombs. This boss looks cool but is a joke. The reason for that is a little more complicated than at first glance though. This boss has some solid ideas in it. It's another attempt at a DPS check idea. Wolnir starts at the back of the arena and will gradually move forwards during the fight, bringing the Abyss with him. If he gets to the other end of the arena, the Abyss itself can damage and easily kill the player, all while being trapped against a wall from Wolnir's attacks. So the goal is to do enough damage to these bracelets which pulls him back to the Abyss. The problem is that this isn't challenging or interesting at all. Wolnir is one of the most passive bosses in this series and is content to sit around and wait until these bracelets are broken, only occasionally putting out an attack or two just to give the illusion that this is an actual boss fight. Unlike Dark Souls 1 or 2, there is no shockingly bad boss in Dark Souls 3. This is honestly as bad as it gets, and that is just kind of unremarkable. This would have been one of the mid-tier bosses in Dark Souls 2, and I think that speaks to Dark Souls 3's huge improvements in quality. What an intro for this boss. Pontiff Sylvain is analogous to Ornstein and Smough, capping off the mid-game peak in difficulty with one of the hardest fights in the game. The reason for that varies from fun and challenging to questionable bullshit. It can be fun and challenging because Pontiff has some of the longest combos of any boss in the series. It can easily deplete a whole stamina bar to block and even just a dodge, which makes this fight very defensive compared to most other bosses. If you are caught in one of these combos, it is most likely going to either bring you to the brink of death or kill you outright. Beyond that, he has a lot of mix-ups that make the fight extremely unpredictable. He can switch from being fairly passive to one of the most aggressive bosses in the series on a dime, which can make finding healing or attack windows very risky. The reason this fight can also be questionable bullshit is that some of his attacks are simply too fast to reasonably avoid. This forward thrust is near instant and is basically guaranteed damage if you aren't using a shield. And then there's the second stage. Some people think it makes the fight easier. There's certainly an element of truth to this because instead of an independent version of Pontiff or another boss entering the fight, it's an exact clone of Pontiff who will broadcast exactly what the real Pontiff is about to do. Sometimes. And it's this sometimes that can make this fight very annoying in the second phase. Sometimes the clone just doesn't do the same thing as the real Pontiff at all, and this is bullshit because the player has no idea when to reasonably expect the clone to break his own rules. Normally though, it does actually make the fight a bit easier because the fight slows down and you can bait out attacks for larger damage windows. I haven't had too much trouble on this boss on recent playthroughs, but on my first playthrough, this is actually the only boss in the entire game I summoned for. I found him the hardest in the game initially. Over time, I've definitely softened on Pontiff and now consider him a pretty good boss despite his occasional tendency for bullshit. This next boss has hands down the best build-up in the series so far. First off, the game drops a massive nostalgia bomb right on top of you when you arrive in Anor Londo, the beloved level from the first game, and the home of Ornstein and Smough. Only this time, something is obviously wrong. The giant blacksmith is dead. There's this weird slime coating the ground, the enemies have been replaced with deacons, and oh, what's that? There's a boss door right where Ornstein and Smough used to be. The curiosity this whole build-up cultivates is just so intense and palpable, and when you finally do enter the arena, it has one last nostalgic surprise for you. No, it's not a reskin of Ornstein and Smo, but instead Aldrich, the Devourer of Gods, and oh my god, he has Gwendolyn's body and Priscilla's axe in his second phase. This boss lives up to his namesake. Aldrich has clearly eaten some of the characters from the first game. He looks like he might have gotten Nito as well, sharing the same wispy black cloak dotted with bones. It's a huge surprise and works as a sort of blending together of a few different types of boss fight. The build-up and the lore is definitely this boss's strong suit. Mechanically, it's okay at best, often clunky, and occasionally incredibly frustrating. Aldrich is one of the more passive bosses in the game with primarily ineffective, easily avoidable attacks like these little magic spheres and the very obviously telegraphed magic orb. His melee strikes are even more awkward the way he winds up for absolutely forever, glitching through walls and the floor, all to completely whiff on the final delivery. His only threatening attack in this first stage is the arrow attack that sends a flurry of arrows cascading 300 style, homing towards the player. The area of effect is so wide that it's one of the trickiest attacks in the game to avoid, and the fact that the arrows can briefly stun means that it can be a guaranteed death if caught up in it. This attack is a little scary on the first stage, but one of the most powerful attacks in the game on the second stage because of the vastly increased time given to the arrows. This attack absolutely must be stopped in the second stage, as any attempt to avoid it is risky. That ends up being easier than it first appears by predicting Aldrich's spawn points after he disappears frequently throughout the fight. He always spawns in the furthest corner from the player, so if you bum rush him and get in melee distance, this usually stops him from doing the attack, consequently making it one of the easiest boss fights in the game. And even still, this boss is still special because of that build-up. A lot of people like to refer to Dark Souls 3 as being creatively bankrupt and pandering with constant fan service, but bringing back Anor Londo wasn't just for a cheap reference. They used your nostalgia instead to create an intense feeling of curiosity of how much it has changed and what terrible thing now resides in the most iconic area from the first game. Yorm the Giant is a little disappointing initially for one reason: it's a trick boss. You can try to fight him normally, but that's not a very good idea. Instead, what you were supposed to do is run past him and grab the weapon near his throne. It's the Storm Ruler from Demon Souls, whose weapon art is to throw a giant blast of air that does incredible damage after a lengthy charge up. This means more fumbling around in menus in the middle of a boss fight. Not a very elegant solution. Anyways, after using this weapon, this fight becomes one of the easiest in the game, which is a shame given how intimidating the size of Yorm is. But over time, I've come to terms with this boss and appreciate it for its unique elements from other boss fights. The most substantial being that it is the only boss in the series with another named character ally without having to summon. If you complete the Onion Knight's questline throughout Dark Souls 3, then he will show up to aid you in the fight wielding a Storm Ruler of his own. While it makes the fight even easier than before, I'd argue it's an improvement because the sheer spectacle of two Storm Rulers absolutely decimating the fallen Lord of Cinder is amazing fun and something totally different than any other boss in the series. Trying to fight Yorm normally is not only unsatisfying because of his ridiculous health bar, but also his very limited moveset, which is only slightly better than the last giant from Dark Souls 2. But with the aid of Sigurd and a unique powerful weapon, this fight can be very enjoyable in its spectacle. Dancer of the Boreal Valley, the counterpart to Vord, is the much more successful Outrider Knight of the two. She moves and attacks in a way completely different than any other boss in the series, very unnaturally with delayed spins and hazy movements. This is one of the only instances in the series where this is actually fun and not frustrating like how dogs work in this series. There's obviously a lot of thought put into these moves instead of just an artificial attempt at difficulty. In fact, her attacks are so unnatural that they are difficult to categorize like I've done for most bosses so far. Fittingly, she attacks very much like a dancer, doing graceful spins and bobs, carrying her swords with her through the motions. It's a genuine challenge to reasonably predict, more so than most bosses whose movesets can be figured out after just a couple of attempts. Her second phase isn't super interesting, but amplifies this mechanic even further by giving her a second sword, as well as some extremely deceptive magic AoE attacks. The second stage starts off with one of the most devastating attacks in the game, a Hurricane of Death combo that can easily kill a high-level player if caught up in the storm. Otherwise, the second stage is very similar to the first, just with 2 swords to watch out for instead of 1. It's a very good fight, but one that's difficult to talk about because its central mechanic, the unnatural movements, is pretty much all it has going for it. That sounds like a negative, but in reality, it's this fight's greatest strength. It found a new mechanic to put emphasis on and nailed it. An uncommonly vocal boss, Osiros is one of the only bosses in the series to talk during the fight, and because of that has kind of become a meme. The fight itself isn't spectacular and is one of the few unpolished in the game, with some wonky hitboxes and attacks, weirdly telegraphed tail sweeps, an uneven arena with scenery to block attacks, and the worst charge attack in the series since the Gaping Dragon. These ones stand out more than usual because of Dark Souls 3's generally much higher level of polish and consideration in boss movesets, but besides these issues, the fight's not so bad. It's a very good boss for the lore, showing what happened to the King of Lothric and his invisible baby, but mechanically I don't have a ton to say about this boss. It would be one of the weaker ones if not for the unique vocal elements and the surprise of what the king has turned himself into. I feel kind of bad for this boss because in any other Souls game, this would be one of the best bosses, but because it takes place at the tail end of Dark Souls 3, when nearly every boss is like a little masterpiece, he gets overshadowed by the more heavy hitters. This really is a fantastic boss that can stand with the rest of them. He looks kind of like Ornstein, but brandishing a very different weapon and fighting style. This is intentional because the name of this boss appears to be 100% literal. It is nothing but an animated shell of armor being controlled by the butterflies surrounding the arena. The butterflies are this boss's unique element because they will be spraying projectiles and laser attacks during the fight, just with extremely slow and telegraphed windups to make it not feel like you are being unfairly pelted by off-screen enemies. The threat of the butterflies is intermittent but devastating if caught off guard. The fight against the armor itself is extremely solid and one of the best in the series. The armor has a fairly standard moveset in the first stage of short combos and a ground pound lightning attack, but the real difficulty in this fight is his shield. He has the same kind of near instant shield bash attacks that regular enemies have. They are very easy to be surprised by and can block almost all front-facing damage while turtling behind it. This is rare for Dark Souls bosses, as most of them achieve their difficulty through extreme aggression. The second stage gets a little more interesting when he busts out one of the hardest to dodge attacks in the series with his absurdly long and deceiving windup, only to follow up with a near instant, incredibly damaging and encompassing attack. I am terrible at avoiding this attack and have found the most success by wildly smacking the dodge button while trying to get behind him. The second stage is also when the butterflies start chiming in, so the fight becomes much more defensive as you have 2 very powerful attacks to watch out for. I don't really have any major negatives with this fight. It's impeccably well balanced, beautifully animated, and has an incredible score accompanying it. It's just that it doesn't have the wow factor that most of the bosses adjacent to it have. The one disappointing thing about Udex Gundyr is that the second stage wasn't as polished as the first, and I would have preferred an expanded version of the first half's moveset. Well, here it is. Champion Gundyr is a secret boss that takes place in an alternate version of the tutorial area where the fire has already faded. Champion is very similar to Udex with some added moves and scaled difficulty. It's those new moves, however, that make this one of the hardest bosses in the game and the most aggressive boss in the entire series. Gundyr is the only boss in the series fast enough to hit you on the ground before even recovering from an attack. He's so fast that he can even juggle you like a fighting game character. His shoulder charge and kick are the fastest follow-up attacks in the game and are nearly impossible to avoid without predicting they will happen. This all sounds pretty brutal, and it genuinely is, but his weakness is still his ability to be parried. Instead of turning into a black goop monster in his second phase, he becomes even faster and even more aggressive. The only safe healing window in this entire fight is after this ground slam attack, which he does pretty infrequently. He also has the most difficult to dodge attack in the series, which to this day I still haven't figured out. It's perfectly timed to catch mid-roll after the first swing. I think it's more about spacing than timing, but I'm just really bad at it. Doing this fight with no parries is the biggest strain on your dodging abilities in the whole game. I do think it's a little annoying that he can hit you on the ground, but other than that, this fight is unparalleled in speed and aggression. It's excellent and one of the most challenging in the series. The second trick boss in Dark Souls 3 is the Ancient Wyvern, who like Yorm is not meant to be fought like a normal boss. Instead, what they've designed is a gauntlet of enemies guarding a drop-off point for an instant kill plunging attack. So the gauntlet ends up being much more challenging than the boss itself. It's unfortunate that it's filled with some of the most annoying enemies in the game, the snakes with no telegraph for huge dual-wielding knife combos, and the real boss, the chain axe wielding big snake guarding the final bridge. It's honestly easier to just run past all of them and then come back when the boss is dead later. I don't have much to say about this boss because it's not really a boss at all, just a one-trick pony who only benefits from the surprise of the initial run of the gauntlet. Because of that, it's very difficult to judge this boss because I'd be rating the gauntlet instead of the boss itself. But since the gauntlet is just kind of a smattering of enemies thrown together without any real thought as to how the player is actually supposed to make it through without getting overwhelmed, it's nothing thrilling. I appreciate that they tried to do something different, but that doesn't always guarantee success. Even after saying all that, it is a secret boss in an obscure area, so I don't feel like I can criticize it too heavily. But the real star of the secret bosses is undoubtedly the Nameless King, Gwyn's lost firstborn son, widely considered to be the most difficult boss in the game. That I don't agree with, but I do think he's one of the best. I think the reason many find him so difficult is that it's an unparalleled challenge of endurance to this point. It's 2 stages like every boss, but 2 entire health bars separated by a cutscene like the Abyss Watchers. The first stage is against the king riding a dragon. The attacks are extremely slow to compensate for the flying around and harder to see telegraphs, but hit hard. There's lightning bolts thrown from the air, downward strikes and sweeps, and an AoE ground pound from the king himself. The dragon really only has fire breath, I think not to overwhelm the player with too complex movesets. Mostly it's just okay though, which is a shame for the literal god of war riding a dragon. It's the second phase that cements this boss as one of the greats. The Nameless King absorbs the dragon's power in an homage to Ornstein and Smo and fights one-on-one with new abilities. His moves are some of the most polished and tricky to dodge in the whole series, populated by a cavalcade of delayed timings and mix-ups. Almost his entire moveset is designed to punish for rolling too early, delaying his attacks just a second after rearing back, and then the second swipe in his short combo is to punish for dodging too late, coming very quickly after the first. He has some special moves too, like this Wind Blast ranged attack, a long-range charge from the air, a lightning kick and ground pound, and an extremely tricky ranged attack where he casts lightning into the air that homes in on the player just a second or two after the cast. It hits instantly and for huge damage too. It's a handful. The sheer variety of attacks would be one thing, but the fact that every single attack is challenging to avoid in some way makes this boss an immense challenge on first encounter. That appeal has definitely faded over time, however, and I've killed him on my first or second try consistently ever since, but I will never forget that first evening spending a couple hours straight to finally take down this monster of a boss. One of the most satisfying feelings I've had in a Souls game. Today, I still have a great respect for this boss and consider him one of the best in Dark Souls 3, even though the king's power has clearly faded. And finally, we have my favorite boss in the main game of Dark Souls 3, the twin princes Lorien and Lothric. This boss has a new mechanic that is both fun and challenging and throws a mix-up into the basic boss fight formula by way of teleporting attacks. In the first stage, Lorien has his normal horizontal and thrusting strikes at close range, but also has the ability to teleport, usually at the end of the combo, which can then follow up with a few different attacks, either straight into another fast swing, a drop attack from the air, a thrust, or a very slow magic attack that is positioned far enough away to where it breaks the lock-on, forcing the player to scan their surroundings to locate the incoming attack in a limited time frame. This is great because it makes the fight feel unpredictable. This tests your vigilance and split-second decision-making, either dodging a near-instant attack or holding off a second. Lorien's thrust attack out of the teleport is just perfectly timed to catch a player at the end of their roll if they reflexively roll at the beginning of the teleport. You have to wait for just a second and then act immediately. All of this would make for a pretty good boss, but it's the second stage that really elevates this fight into one of the best in the series. After Lorien falls, Lothric descends from the throne and revives him, now clinging to his back and adding a whole other set of attacks to Lorien's familiar moveset, with magic attacks reinforcing the challenge of teleportation. What makes this even harder is that this is the greatest test of endurance in the game so far. If Lorien falls, Lothric will infinitely revive him over and over again until Lothric himself falls. You can try and avoid this entirely by holding attacks until Lothric is in view, but this is much more difficult than it seems. Thankfully, when Lothric is in the process of revival, it is a huge damage window where the player can easily wipe out a good amount of health. Mechanically, it's near perfect, but this boss's greatest strength is its place in the overall game and its presentation. Because of Dark Souls' non-linearity, it typically has a problem towards the end game, making bosses feel climactic and challenging for a late game player. Dark Souls 3 is the first game in the series to really nail this. While it is more linear when it comes to the sequence, bosses have to be done in a much more linear order than past titles, the trade-off is that the balancing is much more precise. This fight is perfectly positioned and balanced for the tail end of the player's journey. This boss also has an amazing score, easily my favorite in Dark Souls 3 and a contender for the best boss theme in the series. It's got this melodic violin in the first stage and bombastic, climactic vocals in the second. Lorien and Lothric are amazing. I don't have anything really negative to say. The presentation is top tier, the mechanics are thrilling intense, just fantastic. The first DLC boss is an interesting one. It's mostly to introduce the new arena feature, but that's at the cost of a mediocre boss taking up one of the only 2 slots in the first DLC, Ashes of Ariandel. Champion's Gravetender first pits you against a couple of wolves and a single NPC with a new weapon that can block and attack in the same hand. It sounds cool, but it doesn't have a dramatic effect on gameplay, and the opening plays kind of similar to the Capra Demon, a mad scramble to get rid of the wolves before you get overwhelmed. The actual fight against the Gravetender is just like fighting a regular hostile NPC. He can be parried, backstabbed, and poise broken, so it's not really difficult or interesting in the slightest. Once he reaches half health, the second stage is a little more interesting, but still derivative of an earlier enemy, the large wolf that hunts you through the first section of the DLC. Because of the Gravetender's low poise and health, it's not very difficult to burn him down before the wolf shows up to do any damage, so this fight isn't even really a multi-boss fight either. Instead, the real difficulty comes from this wolf and the awkwardly telegraphed attacks all enemies of this type share in this series. I think they wanted this fight to feel like Sif, but it's significantly more awkward due to the speed and agility of this wolf. It has a very similar repeated charge attack to Vort, and it feels just as inconsistent as it did in that fight, and its close range attacks are the same as the Pontiff beasts, some of the most awkwardly telegraphed attacks in the series. None of this makes for a very engaging boss fight, but at the end of the day, it's still not terrible. A lot of people despise this fight, and while I certainly can't defend it too much, I don't think it's that bad. There's only 2 bosses in Ashes of Ariandel, and the first was just kind of mediocre. Sister Frida appears to be the reason for that. Sister Frida seems to be where all the money went and is one of the most complex, challenging, and well-designed bosses of the whole series. Its first stage is deceptively difficult despite Frida's lacking health pool and poise, as well as being susceptible to parries and backstabs. She has extremely long and damaging combos and some of, if not the fastest attacks in this series. There's some homages to past bosses like Priscilla here too, finally bringing back the invisibility mechanic and expanding on it. Instead of using footsteps in the snow, Frida is largely located by sound if you listen for her landing after she jumps away from this attack. This leaves a massive damage window open if you can locate her. She is completely open for a backstab, but if she does complete her attack in this animation, it's a devastating homing grab attack. She's even got a status effect threat in the form of frostbite, which spreads out on the ground from some of her attacks. But ultimately, her weaknesses make her a fairly approachable challenge in this first stage. The second, instead, is another take on a multi-boss fight, fighting both Sister Frida and Father Ariandel together. Frida is much more passive in this stage, sitting back and throwing out an attack or two instead of locking you into combos in an enclosed space. It's Ariandel who's the one who puts out the most aggression. At first, he seems like an easily abusable large boss with a limited front-facing moveset, but his attacks are surprisingly aggressive and damaging. His most common move is this gradual slam charge attack that can take him across the entire arena, smashing his pot down over and over again. This moves very quickly and can easily smash you to pieces if busy with Frida, and he has some huge AoE fire slam and breath attacks that can reach a good distance across the arena. Since they share the same health bar, it's actually easier to ignore Frida entirely in this phase and attack Ariandel's backside. Well, the developers thought of that, and Frida will go invisible and cast a healing spell periodically to make that strategy not entirely optimal. Instead, you have to treat both targets with respect and as potential threats throughout the entire ordeal, exactly the way a boss against multiples is supposed to work. Its only real fault is the overly passive nature of Frida in this stage. I'm not being entirely disingenuous when I said that this is actually easier to ignore Frida, just pay attention to her periodically when going for a heal. It's an interesting and mostly successful take on a multi-boss fight, and the first stage is a solid expansion on some ideas that weren't fleshed out well enough before. That seemed a little too easy, didn't it? Sister Frida is the first 3-stage boss fight in this series, and the way they go about revealing that is nothing short of mischievously genius. They actually give you the boss reward after dispatching Frida and Ariandel in the second stage, relaxing the nerves and lulling you into a false sense of security before dropping this whopper of an attack on you. This is just insane. Easily the greatest test of endurance in the series so far, having to empty 3 entire health bars on a single go. To make matters even worse for the player at this point, Black Flame Frida is not a botched 3rd stage that ends up being the easiest. This version of Frida is the most aggressive and the fastest boss in this series, with recovery times so high, it becomes tricky to score even a single hit with something as quick as a rapier. Add on to that Black Flame magic attacks stacked onto beefed up frostbite attacks and even longer and faster combos that go on for absolutely forever, and you have a recipe for a nightmare scenario. Your dodging has got to be absolutely perfect, as one mistake can leave you locked into huge combos or to get hit with frostbite, which makes it even harder to dodge in the future, affecting your stamina regeneration. It is one of the most intense parts of the whole series and elevates this fight far above what it would have been with just the first 2 stages alone. Sister Frida continues the trend of DLC bosses being brilliant and breaks new ground in terms of endurance and speed challenges. And now we have what might be the final piece of content ever released for Dark Souls, the Ringed City DLC. Its first boss is an homage to Ornstein and Smough, and it's the best demon boss and the best multi-boss fight in the entire series. So the first stage is actually pretty similar to Dark Lurker. It's two very similar enemies, Demon in Pain and Demon from Below, at once in a massive open arena. The twist is that the two demons switch aggressive states on timers, so that one is always passive and using mostly ranged poison attacks, and the other is flailing around like a rampaging ball of fury. There is some bleed over between states that can see both flailing, so you need to 100% run the fuck away when that is happening, but otherwise it's extremely well balanced and challenging. The passive demon's ranged attack is this poison that spreads across the ground in a huge swath from the demon over time. This is perfectly telegraphed by this purple line indicating that the attack is incoming. This means you can focus your attention on the aggressive demon without having to constantly keep the passive one in sight. That worked for Ornstein and Smo because they had very different movesets, but the flailing of both demons at once is almost impossible to avoid, so it's an extremely effective design choice to do it this way. Unlike Ornstein and Smo, however, both demons have to be fully killed before the second stage instead of immediately transitioning once the first falls, and that second stage is just... oh... Depending on which demon died last, the Demon Prince will have different moves in the second stage that vary pretty drastically. If Demon in Pain is killed last, then he gains this Demon King's Firestorm Nuke ability on steroids that blankets basically the entire arena in fiery Armageddon. This attack can be stopped if you can do enough damage to him during the build-up, but he throws down a defense beforehand in the form of these two little spheres that spit fire at you, and jumps a fair distance away before building it up. It's one of the most devastating attacks in the series, and it's trickier than it sounds to stop. If Demon from Below is killed, it's a bit easier, instead spraying a laser all across the map that does ridiculous damage. I prefer fighting Demon in Pain myself because of the increased challenge. The endurance challenge in this fight is maybe even greater than Sister Frida with the Demon Prince's insane health bar and devastating attacks. He's got this dive bomb attack that can break the lock-on, this sweep from the air that leaves lingering fire trails and carries over some of the attacks from the first stage, like the forward thrashing. Only the variety and mix-ups make it much more challenging to avoid than the attacks from the first stage, and the damage is so sky high that you can be killed in a single hit under the right conditions. He's not the most aggressive with follow-up attacks in the game, so it's not the healing animation, rather the supply of Estus that becomes the biggest challenge. It's hard to complain about this boss. If I had to complain about something, it would be the occasional bleed over of aggressive states in the first stage, which can be a little frustrating. The Demon Princes are deserving of a lot of best due to their balanced and well-considered design, their intimidating presentation, and their variety in movesets. Half-Light Spear of the Church is a wonderful idea that is today ruined spectacularly by the garbage Dark Souls community. On release, this was a pretty fun and unique boss fight, having the chance to summon a real player to aid a Painting Guardian for a 2v1 fight. Like the Looking Glass Knight, it also has the chance to summon a much less threatening NPC. When this DLC released, everyone was new, and it made it a much more level playing field, although still heavily weighed in the invader's favor if the player doesn't summon. Today, it is a very different story. The only players still being summoned are the worst of the worst Sellsword Twin Blade Carthus Rouge L1 spammers that are the venom coursing through the barely alive veins of the Dark Souls community. They play like the worst invaders you've ever been up against, constantly running away to buddy up with the hostile Painting Guardians, who by the way have infinite healing and spamming Covenant granted magic abilities. I tried this fight about 5 times online, and it's just not possible with dickheads playing like this. So if you are attempting this fight today, I would suggest going offline to avoid having to deal with the 12-year-olds gloating that they won the most heavily stacked in their favor fight possible by spamming the left bumper. Playing with the NPC, it feels much more balanced in the way the fight was envisioned in the first place. The NPC is actually unique and is much more passive than a real player, making the fight actually doable. He wields the Frayed Blade, a weapon that a lot of invaders use anyways, and mixes it up with magic and ranged attacks. It still feels more like a PvP fight than anything, which is not my thing personally. In the second stage, a second Painting Guardian is summoned, making it a 3v1 if you haven't killed the first. I can't deny that this fight has some good elements, and I love the score. but this is not a fight that has aged well with time, and I can only imagine how much worse it'll be in the future when the developers aren't paying any attention to hackers. Half-Light is one of the most frustrating parts of the series when an actual player gets summoned, and is only kind of unique and okay for an NPC. However, after washing my hands free of the filth still populating the game is the remaining two bosses in the Ring City. The first is Dark Eater Midir, the best dragon boss in the series. First, you have this mini-boss confrontation with him on a bridge where his attacks are much more limited. It's kind of like killing the optional Wyvern back in Archdragon's Peak by baiting out the same two attacks, but it's mostly just a setup for the fight later. It ends by doing a critical attack, sending him to the bottom of a big hole. The fight proper is where his full moveset is unleashed, and it's amazing. Midir is the culmination of every dragon boss so far, taking all of the best elements and expanding on them. Midir has the size and health of the Ancient Dragon, the varied moveset of Sin, and the special unique attacks of Calamite. Let's start with the health. It's perfect. It actually feels like fighting something way beyond your capabilities and not just a regular enemy with wings. Midir's health also behaves differently than most other bosses in the game, taking significantly more damage to the head than the legs like most dragons and beast bosses. This encourages the player to face Midir from the front instead of abusing his size like similar beast-style bosses. From the front, you'll face mostly frantic scrambling and rampaging attacks and this fire breath that is perfectly designed to catch players running under Midir going for the tail. Instead, it's easier to deal with it by waiting a second for it to clear and then running back in for more head damage. Some of these combos he has at this range are mixed up to a degree that isn't seen very often, even for humanoid bosses, with a combo into a forward fire breath or a horizontal sweeping one, or even a combo into a flailing attack or this rampaging charge that takes him a good distance across the arena. And distance is your worst enemy in this fight. Staying close to Midir is essential because his ranged attacks are the most devastating and difficult to avoid in the whole series. His fire breaths can cover huge swaths of the entire arena, and his laser is an instant kill. His second phase is very similar to the first, only gaining some more dark attacks like summoning a bunch of humanity that slowly homes in on the player. He's also vulnerable to a critical attack when he nears low health. Because this fight is so complex and can be over in a second if caught in a ranged attack, initial impressions suffer. Instead, it's a boss that has aged beautifully over time, and now, knowing all his moves, I think the sheer variety and danger of this moveset is absolutely the best the series has to offer when it comes to dragons. At the end of the world, an undead and an unkindled fight for the power of the Dark Soul. So far, the Ring City has finally perfected two of its recurring boss designs. It has the best multi-boss fight in the series with the layered and complex Demon in Pain and Demon from Below, and it produced a genuinely nails-hard dragon fight against Dark Eater Midir. So I find it incomprehensibly impressive that they nailed the final recurring boss design, the Big Knight with a big weapon, so thoroughly that it stands head and shoulders above the others in a series filled with great duels of this type. Slave Knight Gale is the best Dark Souls boss, and I'm gonna go a step beyond that and say that I think this might be my favorite boss ever. So it's going to be difficult to talk about this boss objectively. Previously, I always had Senator Armstrong from Metal Gear Rising as the best because of the sheer spectacle of the thing. That fight in Metal Gear Rising is presented just perfectly. First, you have a couple of minor squabbles with somehow both hilarious and thought-provoking dialogue before being thrown into a final battle in the rubble of a giant robot. That fight is accompanied by the most amazing J-Rock weeb song I've ever heard in my life, and I unironically love it. Don't judge me. It's not the fight mechanically that I find so impressive, it certainly is extremely well designed and there's a lot of variety and challenge to his moveset. It's the presentation and build up of the thing. Slave Knight Gale manages to top that fight, not just in terms of spectacle, but mechanically and narratively too. Let's start with mechanics. Gale has the most varied and complex moveset of any boss in the series. It's another 3-stage, and each stage has a staggering amount of attacks that then completely change by the next stage. The first stage is the simplest, but also has a twist that makes it interesting. Gale moves very unnaturally in a similar way to the Dancer. He scuttles around on all fours and has some attacks that hit so fast and are so strangely telegraphed that it takes a couple of tries just to get used to them. After a couple of attempts, the tells are blatantly obvious and it ends up being the easiest of all 3 stages, but that initial battle can be immensely challenging. You'll also notice Gale's stupid amount of health. This is to compensate for it being a lengthy 3-phase endurance fight on the same health bar without constantly refilling like Sister Frieda. This is what I have been waiting for in this series, a fight that can truly test endurance and still have enough variety to make it interesting. Once he reaches 2/3 health, he'll enter his second stage where his sword is empowered by the blood of the Dark Soul. The way the intro is timed to the music is perfect. The fight in this stage becomes slower, but deceptively more difficult. Gale's attacks now have an X factor. His cloak works as an after trail that will damage beyond the end of his strike just a second after the sword hits. This means both that he is double dipping on damage, you will be hit with both the sword and the cloak upon a failed dodge, and that dodging the sword is not enough. You have to properly time the dodge so that it can dodge the cloak too. It's a minor but a brilliant twist to the basic formula. The amount of iframes you have in Dark Souls 3 is pretty substantial compared to the other games that makes reflexively mashing the dodge button on an incoming attack a little bit more forgiving than in the previous games. Here you're punished for dodging too early and it really forces you to master his dodge timings going a bit later than normally. He also pulls out some other abilities that are used as mix-ups, perfect for catching a player trying to heal or applying a buff. He carries around a fucking machine gun crossbow that does huge damage if caught in a straight line, and the Way of White Corona which boomerangs back to him after a few seconds. The first stage is reflexive aggression. The second stage is honorable and tactical. The third stage is desperate fury. Gale's third stage is when this boss ascends to the absolute top of Dark Souls boss designs. Gale now has lightning attacks that are indicated with a spot on the ground before they strike. This works the same way the lava does with Quelaag, incentivizing more careful positioning as well as the flurry of speedy aggressive attacks Gale now has. Gale is easily the most agile boss in the series and will be leaping and literally gliding all around the map, leaking remnants of the Dark Souls he has consumed, all with the illumination of lightning striking around the map and the pounding, masterfully dramatic score in the background. It is the most striking presentation of a boss in the series to date. The apocalyptic desolate arena, the colorful blasting of gorgeously animated effects, and the deadly rage of Gale and the Dark Soul. It is so visually seductive that I never want this fight to end. Gale now possesses so many moves that the mix-ups become an enormous challenge to reasonably predict. He still carries over his easier to predict standing, circular, and forward sword strikes, but these are mixed up with back-flipping mid-air crossbow attacks and long-range leaps and glides. Only one other boss can compare to this many moves, but it still doesn't cover the distance and variety that Gale can. It is the best moveset of the series, and yet even after saying all that, somehow Gale is just as effective narratively as he is mechanically and visually. Gale is a slave knight, speculated to be one of the oldest undead still walking. The Way of White Corona being a miracle completely lost to time that only he knows. He first brings you into the Ashes of Ariandel DLC on behalf of the painting woman whom the community has collectively decided to call Aria. She wants to paint a new world similar to the painted world of Ariamis in Dark Souls 1 or Ariandel that she currently resides in, but she wants to use the titular Dark Soul as pigment. Gale is who goes in search of it after the events of Ashes of Ariandel. In the Ring City, you'll immediately notice Gale's helpful messages guiding you through the ruins of the Dreadkeep. He's not just helping you, he's leading you. Eventually, you'll end up in the Ring City proper, and at the end of the city is when you are transported to the literal end of time. The world is nothing but barren plains of dust with the few remaining structures of the old world standing like idle-kept monoliths. And this is where Gale resides, only now, he's no longer your friend. And yet he knows this, and he still knows you. Gale's story is tragic but ultimately triumphant. His goal was to find the Dark Soul, and he did, finding it here in this barren place from the blood of the Pygmy Lords who he has consumed. He's been in search so long and consumed so many that it has ruined him, and it was a certainty that Gale accounted for and planned for by sending you to confront him. His blood is the Dark Soul. He sacrificed himself knowing that by consuming the Pygmy Lords, the Dark Soul would be reborn in himself, so he sent the Champion of Ash who freed his lady to finish the job he knew he could not do himself. His final act is done through you, giving Arya the blood of the Dark Soul to create an entire new world embedded with the most powerful thing in the Dark Souls series, the Dark Soul itself. Slave Knight Gale is a masterpiece of a boss fight, and I can say that unironically. Everything the series represents, the brilliant combat mechanics emphasizing patience and diligence, the spectacle of the amazing artists who work on these games, and the trademark wordless storytelling is at its all-time high. How fitting is it that the last boss in the series ends up being the best one? Slave Knight Gale is the last boss chronologically and the final boss of the Ring City, but there is still one more to cap off the Dark Souls experience. This is the end of the world smashing together, the end of the cycle, the end of the Age of Fire, and the end of the series. The final boss is the Soul of Cinder himself, taking place in the most beautifully appropriate boss arena in the entire series. It's like something taken straight out of an anime with a field of flowers, but corrupted by Dark Souls' bleak and desolate world. The Soul of Cinder is an amazing boss fight on so many levels. The Soul of Cinder is not just a generic version of another swordsman battle to close out the series. The Soul is quite explicitly an amalgamation of everyone who lit the first flame. This means yes, you are literally fighting your character from the first game as well as every player connected to you in Dark Souls through shared worlds. His moveset is staggeringly varied and well balanced, from a ninja flipping pyromancer to a sorcerer to a spear or straight sword wielding powerhouse. It starts off with a standard straight sword moveset, which ends up being way faster than a boss of this size would first appear. Mixed in with this are some very well timed delayed attacks for punishing early dodges. The ninja flipping pyromancer is easily the most threatening because he fights at the speed of a regular player using a curved sword, just with increased range and damage. He can even use poison and pyromancies, making this the most challenging of the movesets in this first stage. There's also the transition into a spear with miracles. It's pretty similar to fighting a regular spear enemy, but this one attack where he delays and then thrusts upwards is another perfectly timed attack to punish early dodges. And the final switches to a sorcerer with the usual soul arrow attacks and the not so usual death laser that sprays out for immense damage in a straight line from him. With this many attacks, Soul of Cinder easily has the most variety of any boss in the series. Even still, it's not the moveset that cements this boss as one of the greats, it's the story impact. Because if you remember anything about the First Flame, it wasn't just other players who became Lords of Cinder. The Soul of Cinder's second stage is him regaining full health and summoning the power of Gwyn, the final boss from the first Dark Souls. He gains his weapon, a modified version of his moveset with a Manus-like juggle combo, and in a brilliant artistic choice, his legendary theme from the first game. It's a wave of nostalgia so powerful that it elevates the final fight into something else entirely. This is not just a wicked cool boss fight against a demonic knight type. The combination of nostalgia and unavoidable epic finality reinforces that this is the end of everything. It's a long-time series putting things to rest confidently and pulling on the experience of past titles for maximum emotional impact. And in the end, it's these types of bosses that demonstrate Dark Souls' most unique contribution to boss design, this visual storytelling through music and lore and presentation. It treats bosses not solely as mechanical peaks, but as ways to tell a story through gameplay and presentation. And while I think as a series, it eventually grew to have some extremely well-designed bosses that can fully stand on their own, it's this quality, this wordless storytelling that cements Dark Souls as a memorable series, as an important series. And even though I love Nanomachine's son, I'll always remember Dark Souls as the series that can say more than Hideo Kojima can with just 3 notes.